Arizona's desert holds secrets that most people will never discover. Beneath the scorching sun and endless sand lie forgotten burial grounds where the dead refuse to stay silent. Some graves shift position overnight. Others reject every body buried within them. There are children's cemeteries where toys remain pristine after 70 years, and mass graves that force you to experience the final moments of those buried beneath. Tonight, we're taking you to 10 locations that locals won't speak about, where photographers capture figures that weren't there, where visitors lose hours of time they can never recover, and where touching the wrong memorial stone can leave you suffocating from a death that isn't your own. These aren't legends passed down through generations. These are places you can visit tomorrow if you're willing to risk what follows you home. Welcome to Verified Souls. And whatever you do, don't watch this alone. I never believed in curses until I spent 3 weeks unable to sleep in my own home. My name doesn't matter anymore, not after what happened in those pine forests outside Prescott. But I'll tell you this story because someone needs to know that some places in Arizona demand respect, even if you don't understand why. It started as a simple day hike in October 2019, one of those perfect autumn mornings when the air smells like pine and the sky stretches endlessly blue above the mountains. I'd been living in Phoenix for 2 years, working remote tech jobs and exploring Arizona's wilderness on weekends, and I'd heard about the old trails near Prescott that wound through forgotten pioneer territory. What I didn't know was that some of those trails passed through burial grounds that locals deliberately left off the maps. The cemetery appeared without warning, the way unsettling things often do. One moment I was following a deer trail through dense ponderosa pines, and the next I was standing at the edge of a clearing filled with weathered headstones leaning at odd angles, some dating back to the 1860s, according to the dates I could still read. The place felt wrong immediately, not in the Hollywood horror movie way, but in the way your body knows something before your mind catches up. That primitive instinct that tightens your chest and raises the hair on your arms. Most of the stones were simple wooden markers, rotted and illegible, but a few granite monuments still stood, carved with names of miners and prospectors who died in the territorial days. The clearing was roughly circular, maybe 50 yards across, and absolutely silent despite the forest around me being alive with bird calls and wind through the trees. Not a single sound penetrated that space, as if the air itself had gone dead. I'm not a superstitious person, or at least I wasn't, so I walked into the cemetery with my phone out, taking pictures of the more interesting headstones and thinking about posting them to my hiking blog. The ground felt strange under my boots, softer than it should have been given that we were weeks into a dry spell, almost spongy, like walking on something that gave slightly with each step. About halfway through the cemetery, near a cluster of graves marked only with river stones arranged in rough rectangles, my foot broke through what I thought was solid earth. Not far, maybe 3 inches, but enough that I lurched forward and had to catch myself on one of the larger monuments. My hand landed flat against the sun-warmed granite of a headstone that read, Jeremiah Cole, 1847 to 1923, The Earth Keeps What It's Owed. The moment my palm touched that stone, I felt it, a sensation like ice water flooding through my veins, starting at my hand and racing up my arm into my chest. For just a second, maybe less, I saw something that wasn't there. A man's face, gaunt and furious, with eyes that held nothing but rage and accusation. I jerked my hand back and stumbled away from the grave, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The silence in the cemetery seemed deeper now, oppressive, like the pressure change before a storm. I had the overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of that clearing as fast as possible, but when I turned to head back the way I'd come, I realized I wasn't sure which direction that was anymore. The tree line looked identical in every direction, and the deer trail I'd followed in had vanished completely. I tried to use my phone's GPS, but the screen flickered and died despite showing 70% battery when I'd entered the clearing. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The shadows of the headstones weren't pointing in the same direction. Some angled east, others west, as if each grave generated its own personal sun. I chose a direction at random and walked quickly toward the trees, fighting the urge to run, feeling with absolute certainty that something was watching me from behind every weathered marker. The trail back to my car took twice as long as it should have, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every few minutes, I'd spin around convinced I'd heard footsteps behind me, but the forest was always empty. By the time I reached the trailhead parking lot, the sun was setting, which made no sense because I'd only been hiking for maybe 2 hours total. My phone was still dead. I drove back to Phoenix in the dark, checking my rearview mirror obsessively, seeing things that might have been headlights or might have been something else moving in the blackness behind me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd gotten spooked in an old cemetery and let my imagination run wild. But that night, everything changed. The first incident happened at 2:47 a.m. I woke to the sound of someone walking through my apartment, heavy footsteps on the hardwood floors of my living room. I lived alone on the 3rd floor of a secured building, and I knew with absolute certainty that I'd locked my door. I lay in bed, paralyzed, listening to those deliberate steps moving from room to room, slow and searching, accompanied by a smell I couldn't identify at first. Old earth and something metallic, like rust or dried blood. The footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I watched the handle, waiting for it to turn, but instead I heard a voice, low and rough, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, like someone talking through water or from a great distance. The voice went on for maybe 30 seconds, and then the footsteps retreated back toward the living room and stopped. When I finally worked up the courage to check, my apartment was empty, the door still locked from the inside, but there were muddy footprints on my floor. Not boot prints or shoe prints, but the kind of marks bare feet would make, and they led from my front door to my bedroom and back, fading to nothing halfway across the living room. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I'd sleepwalked, that the mud must have been on my own feet from the hike, even though I'd showered twice since returning and my shoes were still in the car. I cleaned up the footprints and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't, because now I was hearing other sounds, scratching inside the walls, my door handle rattling softly every few minutes, and always that voice, clearer now, repeating the same phrase over and over. Return what's owed. Return what's owed. Return what's owed. It took me until dawn to realize what it meant, to remember the moment my hand touched that headstone and how I'd braced myself against it, how I'd made contact with Jeremiah Cole's grave, but I hadn't taken anything. I'd been careful not to disturb anything, hadn't pocketed any artifacts or broken off pieces of old headstones. I'd taken nothing except photographs. The second night was worse. The footsteps came earlier, just after midnight, and this time they didn't stop outside my bedroom door. They came inside. I felt the mattress compress as something sat down on the edge of my bed, felt the covers tug as if someone was trying to pull them back. The smell of earth and rust was suffocating now, and when I opened my eyes, I saw him. Jeremiah Cole, or what was left of him, sat at the foot of my bed with his back to me. He was more shadow than substance, but I could make out the shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, and when he turned to look at me, I saw that same gaunt, furious face from my vision at the cemetery. His mouth moved, forming words I could now hear clearly. The earth keeps what it's owed, and you owe a debt. I tried to ask what debt, what I'd taken, but my voice wouldn't work. He raised his hand, pointing at me with a finger that seemed to stretch impossibly long, and said, "You touched what was mine. You broke the seal. Now you bring others, or you take my place." Then he was gone, and I was alone in my room with the dawn light starting to seep through my blinds. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I spent hours researching Jeremiah Cole, digging through old Arizona Territory records and mining claims, newspaper archives, and census data. What I found made my blood run cold. Cole had been a gold prospector who'd struck a modest claim in the mountains near Prescott in the 1870s. He'd been known locally as paranoid and violent, convinced that other miners were trying to steal his find. When he died in 1923 at age 76, his obituary mentioned that he'd spent his final years alone on his claim, having driven away family and friends with his obsessive suspicion. But what caught my attention was a smaller article from 1924, a year after his death, describing how several people who'd attended his burial had reported strange experiences afterward, hearing footsteps in their homes, seeing his figure in mirrors, feeling watched. The incident stopped only when the affected individuals returned to his grave with offerings of gold or silver, small amounts pressed into the earth above his coffin. The pattern continued for 17 more nights, each worse than the last. Cole's presence in my apartment grew stronger, more solid, more angry. He began appearing in mirrors, in windows, in the dark corners of rooms. Objects moved on their own. I'd find muddy footprints leading to places footprints couldn't logically go, up walls, across ceilings. The voice became constant, a low mutter just below the threshold of hearing that made it impossible to focus on anything else. I stopped sleeping entirely, couldn't eat, couldn't work. Friends asked if I was sick. I looked sick, felt sick, like something was draining me from the inside out. I lost 15 pounds in 2 weeks. My hands shook constantly. The only time I felt any relief was when I seriously considered what Cole had said: bring others, or take my place. On the 18th night, I broke. I got in my car at 2 a.m. and drove back to Prescott, back to that trailhead, back through those pine forests with a flashlight and a pocket full of silver coins I'd bought from a collector that day. The cemetery was easier to find this time, like it was waiting for me, and when I stepped into that silent clearing, Cole was there. Not as a shadow this time, but as something almost solid standing beside his own headstone. We stared at each other for a long moment, and then I knelt at his grave and pressed the coins into the soft earth, one by one, whispering apologies for a debt I still didn't understand. When the last coin disappeared into the ground, I felt something release, like a rope that had been tied around my chest suddenly cutting loose. Cole's figure faded, and the cemetery filled with sound again. Wind in the trees, insects, the normal noises of a forest at night. I haven't been back to that cemetery since, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps in my apartment. Fainter now, distant, like someone checking to make sure I remember my lesson. The earth keeps what it's owed, and if you're not careful about what you touch in Arizona's forgotten places, you might find out exactly what that means. If you've ever felt followed after visiting an old grave, if you've ever heard footsteps in an empty house, you need to ask yourself what debt you might owe. Because some debts don't end just because you paid them once. Some debts follow you forever, waiting for you to forget, waiting for you to slip up one more time. That's the real curse of places like Pioneer Cemetery. Not that they punish you for what you take, but that they never quite let you go, even after you've given back everything you have. My name is Skylar, and I'm a forensic historian specializing in Arizona Territory Justice records from 1870 to 1890. What I'm about to document contradicts everything I was trained to believe about the nature of photographic evidence. But I've verified these findings through multiple independent sources, and I can no longer dismiss what's happening 3 miles southeast of Tombstone as technical malfunction or collective delusion. This account is being submitted to the Arizona Historical Society with 17 authenticated photographs that should not exist, depicting people who were not present when the images were captured. The cemetery doesn't appear on any modern maps, and most Tombstone locals won't acknowledge its existence even when you show them the coordinates. I first learned about it in March 2019 while researching vigilante justice in Cochise County for my dissertation at Arizona State University. I was reviewing trial records from 1882 when I found a discrepancy that would consume the next 6 months of my life. Newspaper accounts from the Tombstone epitaph mentioned 23 men hanged by local vigilantes for cattle rustling between June and September of that year, but official court records documented only 7 legal executions in the same period. The other 16 men had vanished from the historical record entirely, their names scrubbed from official documents but preserved in private journals and letters I discovered in the Cochise County archives. The names haunted me from the moment I found them, written in faded ink on a page dated August 14th, 1882. Brixton, Caire, Uriah, Azil, Wesley, Rocky, Peyton, Seven, Dylan, Drake, Zaid, Roland, Derrick, Braylon, Harlan, and Taylor. 16 men accused of stealing cattle from prominent ranchers near Tombstone and executed without trial in a single night. According to the Journal of Judith Marlowe, a schoolteacher who witnessed the aftermath, the men were hanged from cottonwood trees near an unnamed wash, their bodies left for 3 days as a warning before being buried in a mass grave that locals refused to mark or acknowledge. Marlowe wrote that she believed the men were innocent, that the real rustlers had fled to Mexico weeks earlier, and that these 16 had been scapegoated by ranchers eager to demonstrate their power. Her journal entry ended with a chilling sentence: "God help those who condemned innocent men, for the earth will not forget what was buried there." I spent weeks trying to locate the burial site using Marlowe's descriptions and old survey maps from the 1880s. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a retired park ranger named Riggs, who'd spent 40 years working in the Tombstone area. When I showed him copies of Marlowe's journal, his face went pale, and he admitted that he knew exactly where the cemetery was located, that he'd stumbled across it in 1987 while tracking a lost hiker, and that he'd never gone back because of what happened to the photographs he took that day. Riggs agreed to show me the location, but refused to accompany me to the site itself. He drew me a detailed map and made me promise I'd leave before sunset, though he wouldn't explain why. The cemetery sat in a shallow depression surrounded by mesquite and palo verde trees, invisible from any nearby road or trail. There were no markers, no headstones, nothing to indicate that 16 men were buried beneath the sun-baked earth, except for 16 river stones arranged in a rough circle about 30 feet in diameter. The place felt wrong immediately, not in an obvious way, but in subtle details that accumulated into dread. The temperature inside the circle was at least 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding desert. No insects entered the space. The stones were smooth and dark, almost black, and arranged with mathematical precision that seemed impossible for a hasty burial in 1882. I took out my camera, a professional DSLR I used for archival documentation, and began photographing the site from multiple angles, making sure to capture the position of each stone and the surrounding landscape. I shot 73 photographs that afternoon in October 2019, working systematically to document every detail. The sun was bright, the sky cloudless, and I was completely alone. I'd verified that by walking the entire perimeter of the area before beginning my work. When I reviewed the images that evening in my hotel room, I nearly dropped the camera. In 41 of the 73 photographs, there were people standing among the stones, figures that had not been visible to my naked eye when I took the pictures. They appeared as solid as any living person dressed in clothing from the 1880s, and in every single image, they were positioned directly behind where I'd been standing. I could see myself in some shots where I'd used a timer, and behind me, sometimes just inches away, stood men in dusty work clothes and hats, their faces clearly visible, their expressions fixed in what I can only describe as accusatory rage. I spent 3 days convincing myself I'd made an error, that there was a rational explanation involving double exposure or digital artifacts. Then I enlarged the clearest photograph and used facial recognition software to compare the figures against historical photographs from the Tombstone archives. I got matches. Not possible matches or likely matches, but absolute positives. The man standing 2 feet behind me in photograph 17 was Brixton Cole, identified from a wanted poster dated May 1882. The figure in photograph 23 was Uriah Patterson, matched to a daguerreotype taken at a Tombstone photography studio in 1881. I identified 11 of the 16 men from the hanging list in my photographs, each one standing in positions they couldn't have occupied, appearing in images taken over a century after their deaths. I returned to the cemetery 4 more times between October 2019 and February 2020, each time bringing different cameras, different photographers, different equipment. My colleague Ahmad from the university accompanied me in November, and his footage showed the same phenomenon, figures appearing in digital files that hadn't been present during filming. A professional photographer named Luella brought thermal imaging equipment in December and captured heat signatures in human form standing in locations where no living person stood. By January, I documented the appearance of all 16 executed men across 70 different images and videos, and I noticed a pattern that made my blood run cold. The figures were getting closer. In my first photographs from October, they stood at the edges of the stone circle. By January, they appeared within arm's reach, and in 3 images they were making physical contact. Hands on shoulders, fingers grasping at clothes, faces positioned as if whispering directly into the ears of the living. The phenomenon wasn't limited to professional equipment. In February 2020, I brought 5 graduate students to the site: Mercy, Ocean, Maddie, Callie, and Hunter, each with their personal smartphones. We spent 2 hours at the cemetery taking casual photographs, selfies, landscape shots, videos. Every single device captured the same figures. Mercy took a selfie near the center of the circle, and when she checked it immediately afterward, she screamed. The image showed her smiling face in the foreground, and directly behind her, so close their faces were nearly touching, stood a man whose hand appeared to be reaching around her throat. We identified him later as Wesley Hammond, age 24 when he was hanged in 1882. Hunter filmed a continuous 10-minute video walking the perimeter of the stones, and in the footage, you can clearly see figures moving in the background, keeping pace with him, staying always just behind him, where his peripheral vision couldn't catch them. What disturbed me most wasn't the appearance of the figures themselves, but what happened after people photographed them. Mercy began experiencing night terrors within a week of our visit, always the same dream, hands around her throat, pressure increasing until she woke gasping. Hunter reported seeing a man in period clothing standing at the foot of his bed at exactly 3:14 a.m. for 9 consecutive nights. Ocean's apartment security footage, which I reviewed personally, shows his front door opening by itself at 2:47 a.m. on multiple occasions, the frame filled briefly with a dark silhouette before the door swings shut again. These weren't isolated incidents. Every single person who photographed the cemetery reported similar experiences, and the pattern was consistent. The manifestations began within 3 to 7 days of taking the photographs and intensified until the person returned to the burial site. I interviewed Riggs again in March 2020, and he finally explained what had happened to him in 1987. He'd taken 6 photographs of the stone circle with a Polaroid camera, and all 6 showed men standing behind him. Within a week, he started seeing the same figures in his home, in his truck, reflected in windows and mirrors. The experiences escalated until he couldn't sleep, couldn't work, couldn't function. A Tohono O'odham medicine man he consulted told him the executed men were trying to show him something, that they wanted their innocence proven, their story told. Riggs returned to the cemetery and spoke aloud a promise that he would acknowledge what happened to them, that he would remember They were innocent men murdered by vigilantes. The manifestations stopped immediately, and he'd kept that promise for 33 years by refusing to acknowledge the cemetery's existence to anyone who asked, believing that keeping others away was the only way to protect them. I realized then what the figures wanted. They didn't haunt the cemetery because they were evil or malevolent. They haunted it because they were innocent men whose executions were never acknowledged, whose names were erased from official records, who were buried without markers in an unmarked grave and forgotten by history. They appeared in photographs because photographs are evidence, documentation, proof of existence. They were trying to prove they existed, that they'd been murdered, that their deaths mattered. The closer they came in successive images, the more desperate they became for someone to acknowledge the truth of what happened on that August night in 1882. In April 2020, I organized a memorial service at the cemetery. I brought the families of Mercy, Ocean, Hunter, Maddie, and Callie, along with Ahmad, Luella, and 3 local historians. We brought 16 wooden markers I'd commissioned, each carved with a name, birth and death dates that I'd researched, and the word innocent. We planted them in the ground around the circle of stones, and I read aloud the names of all 16 men: Brixton, Kyer, Uriah, Azel, Wesley, Rocky, Peyton, Seven, Dylan, Drake, Zide, Roland, Derek, Braylon, Harlan, and Taylor, acknowledging that they'd been executed without trial, that they were likely innocent, and that their deaths deserved to be remembered. Every person present took photographs during the ceremony, and for the first time since October 2019, the images showed only the living. The figures were gone. I visited the cemetery 6 times since April 2020, and the phenomenon hasn't recurred. The wooden markers remain standing, weathered but intact. Mercy's night terrors stopped the day after the memorial. Hunter hasn't seen figures in his bedroom. Ocean's door stays closed. But I keep copies of those original photographs in a locked file at my office. 41 images that shouldn't exist, showing 16 men who were murdered and forgotten, reaching out across more than a century to demand acknowledgement, justice, and memory. They appear in every frame standing, just behind the living, close enough to touch us, trying desperately to remind us that some truths refuse to stay buried, and some debts can only be paid with recognition. If you ever photograph a cemetery and see figures that weren't there when you looked, understand what they're asking. They don't want to hurt you. They just want someone to remember that they existed, that they mattered, and that what was done to them was wrong. Sometimes the dead don't rest because the living won't listen, and in Lost Souls Cemetery 3 miles outside Tombstone, 16 innocent men spent 137 years trying to tell their story to anyone who would finally hear them. My name is Marvin, and these are excerpts from my security logs at St. Mary's Catholic Complex in Central Phoenix, dated between March and June 2018. I'm submitting this documentation to the diocese archives because what I witnessed during my employment there defies rational explanation, and someone needs to understand what happens at 3:47 a.m. in the children's cemetery behind the abandoned church. I worked as night security for commercial properties for 22 years before St. Mary's, and I've never encountered anything that shook my understanding of grief, memory, and the boundaries between the living and the dead until I spent 90 nights alone with the voices of 23 children who never made it home from school on April 17, 1952. The St. Mary's complex sprawls across 4 acres in what's now considered Midtown Phoenix, though in 1952 it sat at the edge of farmland and desert. The main church closed in 1997 after structural damage from settling foundations made it unsafe, but the diocese maintained the property and the small cemetery behind it, where generations of parishioners were buried. My job was simple: patrol the grounds between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., document any security concerns, and make sure transients didn't camp on the property. The first 2 weeks were routine. I'd walk the perimeter with my flashlight, check the locked doors of the church and the old rectory, and spend most of my shift in the security office, reading or watching the 4 exterior cameras. The cemetery occupied the northeastern corner of the property, separated from the main buildings by a walkway lined with oleander bushes. During my initial tour, the property manager, Donald, mentioned almost casually that I shouldn't be alarmed if I heard children's voices at night. It was a known acoustic phenomenon where sounds from the nearby elementary school carried strangely after dark. I nodded and didn't think about it again until my 3rd week, when I discovered the children's garden. The children's garden sat in the oldest section of the cemetery, a roughly circular plot, maybe 40 feet in diameter, enclosed by a low wrought iron fence that had been painted white decades ago, but now showed patches of rust and peeling. Inside the fence were 23 small graves, each marked with a simple white stone bearing a name, birth date, and the same death date, April 17, 1952. The graves were arranged in a spiral pattern, and at the center stood a limestone statue of Mary holding an infant, her face weathered smooth by years of sun and wind. What struck me immediately was how well maintained the graves were compared to the rest of the cemetery. Fresh flowers sat in vases at several headstones. Small toys, teddy bears, toy cars, dolls were arranged carefully on the flat markers. The grass was trimmed neatly, the fence recently repaired. Someone was clearly tending this place, though Donald had told me the entire cemetery had been closed to new burials since 1995 and rarely received visitors anymore. I read the names on the stones that first afternoon: Sky, Aileen, Nariah, Ileana, Leah, Linda, Livia, Magdalena, Elia, Kalani, Micah, Tiffany, Renly, Zania, Love, Andy, Johanna, Skyla, Alia, Deborah, Zainab, Aeneas, and Greta. 23 children, ages 6 through 12, all dead on the same day. When I returned to the office, I searched the archives in the filing cabinet and found a manila folder labeled April 17th, 1952, St. Mary's School. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, accident reports, and photographs that told the story I wish I'd never learned. The children had been students at St. Mary's parochial school, heading home on a Thursday afternoon in a school bus, driven by a man named Leonard. At 3:47 p.m., on a stretch of road that's now part of Central Phoenix, but was then empty desert, the bus was struck by a delivery truck that ran a stop sign. The impact caused the bus to roll 3 times before coming to rest on its side in an irrigation ditch. All 23 children died, along with Leonard. The truck driver survived and was never charged. Witness statements confirmed he'd swerved to avoid a dog that had run into the road. The folder contained photographs from the scene that I couldn't look at for more than a few seconds, and lists of the victims with their ages and home addresses. What disturbed me most was a letter from the parish priest at the time, Father Nathaniel, describing the funeral mass held for all 23 children simultaneously. He wrote about how the families insisted the children be buried together in a special section of the cemetery, how they'd commissioned the statue of Mary as a memorial, and how parents continued to visit daily for months afterward, leaving toys and flowers as if the children were still alive, still playing, still needing comfort. The letter ended with a sentence I couldn't stop thinking about. The parents say they hear the children at night, laughing and playing as if nothing had happened. And I confess I have heard it too, though I dare not tell them it may not be imagination. That night, my first experience with what happens at 3:47 a.m. began exactly on schedule. I was in the security office reviewing camera footage when I heard it. Children's laughter, distant but clear, coming from the direction of the cemetery. Not one voice, but multiple voices, overlapping, the sound of kids playing tag or hide and seek. I checked the exterior cameras focused on the cemetery and saw nothing unusual, just empty graves and the statue reflecting moonlight. The laughter continued for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I marked it in my log as acoustic phenomenon per property manager, and tried to dismiss the fact that my hands were shaking. The laughter came again the next night at exactly 3:47 a.m., and every night after that for the next 3 months. It never varied by more than a few seconds, always starting precisely at 3:47 and lasting between 90 seconds and 3 minutes. Always the same quality, joyful, innocent, the sound of children playing without a care in the world. During my 4th week, I decided to investigate directly. At 3:45 a.m. on a Tuesday night in April, I positioned myself at the edge of the children's garden with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and a determination to prove this was some kind of natural phenomenon or prank. At exactly 3:47 a.m., the laughter started, but this time I was close enough to hear details. Individual voices, distinct and clear. A girl calling out, "Aileen, you're it." Another voice, younger, saying, "I found Sky hiding by the statue." A boy's voice, counting loudly, 18, 19, 20. The voices seemed to come from inside the fenced area, moving around as if children were actually running between the graves. I turned on my flashlight and swept it across the garden. There was nothing there. No children, no movement, just graves and toys, and the patient face of Mary watching over empty ground. But the voices continued, and then something happened that made me drop the flashlight. One of the toys moved. A red rubber ball sitting on Kalani's grave rolled slowly toward Micah's marker, about 6 feet away, as if pushed by invisible hands. Then a teddy bear on Tiffany's stone shifted position, turning to face outward. I heard footsteps, the sound of small feet running on grass, and the laughter intensified, becoming almost frantic, as if the children were trying desperately to make themselves heard. The recorder in my hand was running, capturing everything, and I stood frozen watching toys rearrange themselves in the darkness, while voices that shouldn't exist called out names and played games that ended 66 years ago. The activity lasted exactly 3 minutes, and then silence fell so completely it felt like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire world. I retrieved my flashlight with trembling hands and examined the toys. Every single one looked brand new. The teddy bears showed no wear. The toy cars had no rust. The dolls' dresses were crisp and clean. These weren't old toys weathering in the elements. They were pristine, as if they'd been purchased yesterday. I reported what I'd witnessed to Donald the next day, playing him the audio recording. The voices came through clearly, along with the sounds of movement and play. He listened without interruption, then opened a desk drawer and pulled out a file folder labeled Security Reports 1998-2017. Inside were dozens of reports from previous night guards, all describing identical experiences. A guard named Arav had documented the phenomenon in 2003. Abdil had reported it in 2009. Kareem in 2012. Corey, Emmett, Wilder, and Cohen had all filed reports between 2014 and 2016. Every single guard who'd worked night shift at St. Mary's had heard the children playing at 3:47 a.m. Most had investigated. All had reached the same conclusion. Something impossible was happening in the children's garden, and the diocese had no explanation for it. Donald told me that several paranormal investigation teams had examined the site over the years. They'd documented electromagnetic anomalies, temperature fluctuations, and audio phenomena consistent with what they called residual haunting, a replay of traumatic events imprinted on a location. But none of them could explain why the toys stayed new, why the voices were so clear and distinct, or why the phenomenon occurred at exactly 3:47 a.m. every single night without fail. Over the following weeks, I began to recognize individual voices. Sky had a high, sweet laugh that reminded me of my own daughter at that age. Ileana sang songs while playing, her voice carrying a melody I later identified as a 1950s children's tune. Deborah seemed to be the oldest, organizing games and making sure everyone was included. I learned their patterns: hide and seek on Mondays and Wednesdays, tag on Tuesdays and Thursdays, something that sounded like Red Rover on weekends. They never sounded sad or frightened. They never cried or called for parents. They played endlessly, joyfully, as if April 17th, 1952 had never happened, as if they were still alive, and this was recess, and nothing would ever hurt them again. The sadness I felt listening to them became almost unbearable. These children didn't know they were dead. They were trapped in the last moment of innocence before the accident, playing forever in a loop of happiness that would never end and never progress. In May, I started researching the families of the 23 children. Most had moved away from Phoenix in the years following the accident, unable to bear living near the cemetery where their children were buried. A few families remained, and I managed to contact 3 of them. Judith Morrison, now 84 years old, had lost her daughter Linda in the accident. When I asked her about the toys in the cemetery, she started crying. She told me that she'd placed a doll on Linda's grave in 1952, a week after the funeral, and that doll was still there, unchanged, looking exactly as it had 66 years ago. She'd replaced it 3 times over the decades, thinking someone was stealing the original. But each replacement toy showed the same phenomenon. It never aged, never weathered, never showed any sign of time passing. She asked me if I'd heard the children playing, and when I confirmed that I had, she said something that haunts me still. They're not ghosts, not really. They're stuck in that moment right before the accident, the moment when they were happiest and safest. God won't let them remember what happened next. It's mercy, in a terrible way. I spoke with Junior Hayes, whose sister Zainab had died at age 8. He told me that he still visited the cemetery every year on April 17th, the anniversary of the accident, and that he always heard voices at exactly 3:47 a.m. He said the time was significant. It was exactly when the bus left the school parking lot, beginning the journey that would end in the irrigation ditch 15 minutes later. The children weren't haunting the cemetery, he explained. They were haunting the last moment of their lives, when everything was normal and safe. They were playing in the back of the bus, laughing and talking, completely unaware that they had only minutes left. The cemetery wasn't special. It was just where their bodies ended up, and the echo of their happiness followed them there. I asked him about the toys, and he smiled sadly. He said the toys were gifts from parents who refused to let go, and maybe the children's joy somehow kept them new, preserved them as a reminder that life continues in ways we don't understand. My last night at St. Mary's was June 22nd, 2018. I couldn't continue working there. The weight of what I heard every night at 3:47 a.m. had become too much to bear. But that final night, I did something I'd avoided for 3 months. I sat in the children's garden at 3:45 a.m. and waited, and when the voices started, I spoke to them. I said the names of all 23 children aloud: Sky, Aileen, Nariah, Ileana, Leah, Linda, Livia, Magdalena, Aaliyah, Kalani, Micah, Tiffany, Renly, Zanaya, Love, Andy, Johanna, Skyla, Aaliyah, Deborah, Zainab, Aeneas, and Greta. I told them they were remembered. I told them they were loved. I told them their families never forgot them and never would. The laughter stopped for just a moment, silence falling across the garden, and then it resumed, softer now, gentler, almost peaceful. I don't know if they heard me. I don't know if any of this makes sense or has meaning, but I left St. Mary's that night believing that some griefs are too large to process, some losses too profound to accept, and that maybe, just maybe, the universe finds ways to soften the edges of tragedy by preserving moments of joy forever, even if those moments haunt the living who remain to witness them. My name is Dustin, and I'm writing this from a hospital bed in Tucson, where I've spent the last 48 hours under psychiatric observation after what the doctors are calling a severe panic attack. They're wrong. What happened to me at Evergreen Cemetery in Bisbee on October 9th, 2021 wasn't a panic attack. It was something infinitely worse. It was dying. Not my death, but the deaths of 47 men crushed and suffocated in a mine collapse on August 23rd, 1904, and I experienced every single second of it because I made the mistake of touching a memorial stone that should have been left alone. I was in Bisbee with my girlfriend, Kaya, for a long weekend, One of those spontaneous road trips from Phoenix where you drive to a historic mining town, wander through antique shops, and take artsy photographs of old buildings. We'd spent Friday afternoon touring the Copper Queen mine, riding the underground cart through tunnels that smelled like wet rock and metal. Listening to our guide, Wayne explain the brutal working conditions miners endured in the early 1900s. The tour was fascinating but claustrophobic. I'd felt my chest tighten in those narrow passages, the weight of the mountain pressing down from above, and I'd been relieved when we emerged back into sunlight. That should have been warning enough, but I'm stubborn. And when Kaya suggested we visit Evergreen Cemetery on Saturday morning to photograph the historic graves, I agreed without thinking. Evergreen Cemetery spreads across a hillside overlooking Bisbee, established in 1892 and containing over 14,000 burials, according to the information board at the entrance. The place is beautiful in a melancholic way. Weathered headstones tilting at various angles, names worn smooth by desert wind, wildflowers growing between graves. We wandered for about an hour taking pictures, reading epitaphs, marveling at how many young people were buried there, victims of mining accidents and diseases that modern medicine would have easily prevented. Kaya was drawn to the ornate Victorian monuments, while I found myself gravitating toward the simpler markers in the older sections. That's how I found the memorial. It wasn't large or elaborate, just a rough granite block about 3 feet tall, positioned alone on a flat section of ground away from individual graves. The stone was dark gray, almost black in places, and carved with simple lettering that read, "In memory of the 47, August 23rd, 1904, they went down together, and together they remain." Below the inscription were names. I counted them quickly: Wayne, Ahmed, Madden, Quincy, Bellamy, Lachlan, Layton, Amias, and 39 others whose names I'd later struggle to remember. There was no explanation of what happened, no details about how they died, just the date and that haunting phrase about going down together. I called Kaya over to see it, and she immediately started researching on her phone. Within minutes, she'd found newspaper archives from 1904 describing a catastrophic collapse in the Copper Queen mine, where a support beam failure caused 3 levels of tunnels to cave in simultaneously, trapping and killing 47 miners who were working the night shift. The article she read aloud described how rescue efforts continued for 6 days before being abandoned. The tunnels were too unstable, the risk of further collapse too great. The bodies were never recovered. The mine simply sealed that section permanently, and the 47 men remained entombed in the mountain where they died. The memorial stone, erected by the mining company and the miners' families, was the only marker these men would ever have. I felt a wave of sadness reading the story, imagining the terror of being trapped underground with no hope of rescue, slowly suffocating as oxygen ran out. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my palm flat against the memorial stone, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement. The granite was warm from the morning sun. For just a second, everything seemed normal. Then the world inverted. That's the only way I can describe it. Reality twisted inside out, and I was no longer standing in a sunny cemetery with my girlfriend beside me. I was 3,000 feet underground in absolute darkness, and I couldn't breathe. The sensation was so immediate and total that I didn't have time to process it. One moment, I was Dustin touching a memorial stone in 2021. The next, I was Ahmed, or maybe Madden, or Quincy. I couldn't tell whose consciousness I'd merged with because there were so many voices screaming in my head, all talking at once, all saying the same thing. Can't breathe, can't breathe, can't breathe. The darkness was complete, thicker than anything I'd experienced. A darkness that pressed against my eyes like a physical weight. I could feel rock crushing my legs, not Dustin's legs, but someone else's legs, pinned under tons of debris. The pain so intense, it transcended pain and became something else. A sensation so overwhelming, my mind tried to shut down rather than process it. I tried to scream but couldn't because there was no air, or what little air remained was filled with dust so thick it coated my throat and lungs like concrete. I was choking on the mountain itself, drowning in powdered rock. My hands, multiple hands, dozens of hands that were mine but also weren't mine, clawed at the rubble, fingernails breaking, skin shredding, accomplishing nothing because there was nowhere to go, no way out, just thousands of tons of earth that had fallen and would never be moved. I could hear voices nearby, men calling out names, asking who was hurt, who was alive, but the voices grew weaker with each passing minute as the air turned poisonous and the dust settled into our lungs. Someone near me, Lachlan, I somehow knew his name was Lachlan, was crying for his wife Barbara, saying her name over and over until his voice failed and became a wet, rattling sound that I realized was him choking on his own blood. The worst part wasn't the physical pain or even the suffocation. The worst part was the awareness. I could feel all 47 of them dying around me. Their consciousness connected somehow in those final moments, sharing their terror and despair like a network of agony that amplified with each death. When Bellamy's heart stopped, I felt it. A sudden absence, a voice dropping out of the chorus of panic that filled my head. Then Leighton died, and Amias, and one by one the voices fell silent until only a handful remained, and we knew, I knew, that we were next, that there was no rescue coming, that the mountain had claimed us and we would die here in darkness with tons of rock for a coffin. I tried to pray, but couldn't remember any prayers. I tried to think of my family, my life, anything except the crushing pressure and the darkness and the desperate need for air that consumed everything else. Time lost meaning. Was I dying for minutes or hours? I couldn't tell. The pain eventually dulled into numbness, and the panic gave way to a terrible calm. The calm of acceptance, of knowing death was seconds away, and there was nothing left to fight. My thoughts became fragmented, flashing through memories that weren't mine, lives I'd never lived. I saw Ahmed's wife Anais holding their newborn daughter Rebecca, her face filled with joy. I saw Madden's mother Mercy teaching him to read by lamplight in a tiny house. I saw Quincy working his first day in the mines at age 14, proud to be earning money for his family. All these memories flooded through me simultaneously, 47 lifetimes compressed into the space between heartbeats. And then the final darkness came. Not the darkness of the mind, but the darkness of death itself, absolute and final. And I felt myself dissolving into it. I came back to consciousness on the ground beside the memorial stone, with Kaya screaming my name, and a retired EMT named Ziair, who'd been visiting his grandfather's grave performing CPR on me. Later, they told me I'd been unconscious for 3 minutes, that my heart had stopped, that Ziair had literally brought me back from death. But those 3 minutes, from my perspective, they'd lasted hours, maybe days. I'd lived through an entire mine collapse, experienced the deaths of 47 men in visceral, horrifying detail, and the knowledge of what I'd felt was too overwhelming to process. I couldn't speak. I couldn't explain. I just lay on the ground gasping for air that suddenly felt like the most precious thing in existence, my hands clawing at the grass, my entire body shaking. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes and transported me to Copper Queen Hospital, the same hospital that had treated injured miners in 1904. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent 8 hours in the emergency room undergoing tests, EKG, blood work, neurological examination, psychiatric evaluation. Everything came back normal. No heart issues, no drugs in my system, no medical explanation for why a healthy 32-year-old man would collapse and go into cardiac arrest from touching a piece of granite. The attending physician, a woman named Dahlia, suggested severe anxiety triggered by claustrophobia from the mine tour the previous day. The psychiatrist, Annika, diagnosed a panic attack with dissociative features. Neither of them believed me when I tried to explain what actually happened. that I'd somehow experienced the deaths of 47 miners who'd been dead for over a century. Kaya believed me, though. She'd been standing right beside me when I touched the stone, and she saw what happened next. She said my eyes rolled back, and I started speaking in voices that weren't mine, rattling off names: Gianna, Keziah, Natalie, Cheyenne, Kelly, Louisa, Salma, women's names that meant nothing to us then, but that we later identified as the wives and daughters of the men who died in the collapse. She said I described the darkness, the crushing weight, the suffocation, all of it in real time, as if I was narrating events as they happened. She recorded some of it on her phone before panic set in, and she started screaming for help. When I finally listened to the recording 3 days later, I didn't recognize my own voice. It sounded like multiple people talking at once, overlapping, desperate, speaking in dialects and accents from the early 1900s. I became obsessed with understanding what happened. After being discharged from the hospital, I spent 2 weeks researching the 1904 collapse, reading every newspaper article, examining mining company records, tracking down descendants of the victims. I learned that the memorial stone had been carved from granite taken from the actual collapse site, rock that had been part of the cave-in, saturated with the final moments of the men who died there. I found accounts from other people who'd touched the memorial over the years. A historian named Ora in 1967, a cemetery worker named Carly in 1983, a tourist named Liv in 2009. All of them reported identical experiences: overwhelming visions of the collapse, physical sensations of suffocation and crushing pressure, loss of consciousness, and in 2 cases, temporary cardiac arrest. The phenomenon had a name in paranormal research circles: object imprinting or residual haunting through tactile contact. The theory suggests that traumatic events can somehow embed themselves in physical materials, especially stone, and that touching these materials can trigger a transfer of sensory and emotional information from past to present. The 47 miners didn't haunt Evergreen Cemetery as ghosts or spirits. They haunted that specific piece of granite because it was the last thing they touched, the rock that killed them, and their final moments had somehow become permanently recorded in its molecular structure. Every person who placed their hand on that memorial wasn't just remembering the collapse. They were reliving it, experiencing death through the preserved consciousness of men who died over a century ago. I've tried to move past it, to tell myself it was a hallucination or a medical anomaly, but I can't forget what I felt. The memories of those deaths are as vivid now as my own childhood memories, maybe more vivid. I wake up at night gasping for air, feeling phantom rocks crushing limbs I don't have, hearing voices calling out names I shouldn't know. I've developed severe claustrophobia. I can't ride elevators, can't be in rooms without windows, can't even pull blankets over my head without panicking. My therapist says it's PTSD from a traumatic experience, and maybe she's right, but it's PTSD from trauma I didn't personally experience, trauma that happened to other people in another century. The Diocese of Tucson, which maintains Evergreen Cemetery, installed a small fence around the memorial stone in November 2021, about a month after my incident. There's now a sign warning visitors not to touch the monument, though it doesn't explain why. I've contacted them multiple times requesting they remove the stone entirely, or at least provide a proper warning about what touching it can cause, but they've refused, citing the historical significance of the memorial and the wishes of descendants who want their ancestors remembered. I understand the impulse to preserve history, to honor the dead, but this goes beyond remembrance. That stone doesn't just commemorate death. It allows you to experience it, forces you to die alongside men who died in terror and darkness, and nobody should have to feel that. If you ever visit Evergreen Cemetery in Bisbee, if you see that dark granite memorial to the 47, I'm begging you, don't touch it. Don't place your hand on the stone out of respect or curiosity or any other reason. The dead don't need your touch to be remembered. And what they left behind in that rock isn't a memory. It's a trap, a doorway into the worst moments of their existence. And once you've walked through it, once you've felt what they felt as they died, you'll carry it with you forever. 3 minutes of unconsciousness translated to hours of experiencing death. And I'll never be the same person I was before I touched that stone. Some history shouldn't be preserved. Some memories are too terrible to share. And some deaths are so horrific that even a century later, they're still happening, still playing out in endless loops for anyone unfortunate enough to make contact with the place where they ended. My name is Teresa, and I've been the groundskeeper at Desert Bloom Cemetery in southeast Tucson for 31 years. What I'm about to tell you has been documented in my maintenance logs, witnessed by dozens of visitors, and verified by 3 separate diocesan investigations, but the Catholic Church refuses to acknowledge it publicly because they don't have an explanation that doesn't contradict everything they teach about death, the soul, and what happens to children who die before baptism. I'm retiring next month at age 67, and I need someone to understand what I've watched happen every full moon for 3 decades in a cemetery that contains over 200 graves, but feels completely impossibly empty. Desert Bloom isn't on any tourist maps of Tucson, and most Catholics in the diocese don't know it exists. The cemetery was established in 1934 by the Archdiocese specifically for limbo burials, infants who died before baptism, stillborn babies, children who passed before receiving the sacraments. Catholic doctrine at the time taught that these souls couldn't enter heaven unbaptized, but they were innocent and therefore couldn't go to hell, so they existed in limbo, a place of permanent separation from God. The families were told their children would never experience suffering, but they would also never experience divine joy. It was meant to be comforting, I suppose, but to grieving parents it felt like eternal emptiness. And that's exactly what Desert Bloom Cemetery became, a monument to emptiness, to absence, to children who existed in a theological gray area that the Church has since abandoned but never formally recanted. I started working here in April 1993, hired by the diocese to maintain the grounds and keep vandals away. The cemetery occupies 5 acres of desert scrubland surrounded by a 6-foot adobe wall that's crumbling in places, but still stands. Inside are 214 graves arranged in concentric circles around a central fountain that hasn't had running water since 1962. Every grave is marked with a simple white cross bearing a name and dates, sometimes just a birth date, and death dates separated by hours or days, sometimes the same date for both. The names I read during my first week still haunt me. Azari, Daphne, Rebecca, Amiri, Berkeley, Emberlyn, Hunter, JC, Malaysia, Mariana, Amaris, and on, circles within circles of children who never had a chance to live. What struck me immediately was how empty the place felt. Not just lacking visitors, though in 31 years, I've seen maybe 24 people come to pay respects, but empty in a way that made the air feel thin, like being at high altitude where oxygen is scarce. The graves themselves looked strange. The dirt covering them was perfectly smooth, unnaturally so, as if someone had just filled them yesterday, even though the most recent burial was in 1978, 15 years before I started. There were no depressions where the earth had settled, no erosion from rain and wind, nothing growing on them despite the cemetery grounds being overrun with desert vegetation. Just smooth, flat expanses of bare earth marking each gravesite in perfect circles about 4 feet in diameter. My predecessor, a man named Emmett, who'd worked here for 23 years before retiring, spent 2 hours training me on my first day. He showed me the irrigation system, the tool shed, the perimeter fence that needed constant repair. Then, as he was leaving, he stopped and turned back with an expression I'll never forget. Not fear, exactly, but profound unease mixed with something like pity. He said, "The graves breathe on full moons. Don't try to stop it. Don't touch the dirt when it's happening. And whatever you do, don't dig." The diocese has been very clear about that last point. Then he got in his truck and drove away, and I stood there, convinced I'd just been hazed by a retiring coworker with a dark sense of humor. The first full moon came 3 weeks later, on May 6th, 1993. I was doing evening rounds at dusk, checking the irrigation lines near the north wall, when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I turned and saw something impossible. The dirt covering the grave of a child named Cheyenne, who died in 1956 at 2 days old, was moving. Not shifting or settling, moving rhythmically, rising and falling maybe half an inch with perfect regularity, exactly like a chest expanding and contracting with breath. I stood frozen, watching this grave breathe, and then I noticed another grave doing the same thing, and another, and another. Within 5 minutes, every single grave in Desert Bloom Cemetery was moving in synchronized rhythm, 214 circles of earth rising and falling together, like the cemetery itself had become a living organism. I approached Cheyenne's grave slowly, my heart hammering, and knelt beside it. The movement was unmistakable, steady, rhythmic breathing at about 12 breaths per minute, exactly the respiratory rate of a healthy infant. I reached out to touch the dirt, remembering Emmett's warning but too curious to resist, and the moment my fingers made contact, the breathing stopped. Not just at Cheyenne's grave, but everywhere. All 214 graves went still simultaneously, and the silence that followed felt accusatory, like I'd interrupted something sacred and private. I pulled my hand back, and after maybe 30 seconds, the breathing resumed. I watched for another hour as the sun set and darkness fell, and the graves continued breathing, visible in my flashlight beam as gentle undulations in the dirt that should have been impossible. I reported it to the diocesan office the next morning, expecting skepticism or dismissal, but the priest I spoke with, Father Wilder, just sighed heavily and said, "So it's still happening. We'd hoped maybe it had stopped." He explained that the breathing phenomenon had been documented since 1962, shortly after the Second Vatican Council began the process of phasing out the concept of limbo. Various theories had been proposed: subsurface water creating pressure changes, desert animals burrowing beneath the graves, seismic activity, even mass hallucination, but none explained why it only happened during full moons, why it affected every grave simultaneously, or why the respiratory rate was precisely that of a human infant. 3 separate investigations by church officials had confirmed the phenomenon but refused to call it supernatural, preferring terms like unexplained geological activity that everyone knew were euphemisms for admitting they had no idea what was happening. Father Wilder told me what Emmett had: don't interfere with the breathing, don't disturb the graves, and never, under any circumstances, dig. When I asked why, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Because we don't know what we'd find, and some questions shouldn't be answered." That response terrified me more than the breathing itself, because it implied the church had considered excavating, had perhaps even begun to do so, and had encountered something that made them decide permanent mystery was preferable to whatever truth lay beneath those smooth circles of earth. I wanted to quit right then, but I needed the job, and something about Desert Bloom pulled at me, a sense that these forgotten children deserved someone who would stay, who would witness what happened to them even if no one else cared. The breathing happened every full moon, without fail, for 31 years. I documented each occurrence in my maintenance logs, noting any variations or anomalies. The pattern never changed. The breathing began at dusk and continued until dawn, always at the same rate, always synchronized across all graves. But other details emerged over time that made the phenomenon even more unsettling. During winter full moons, you could see vapor rising from the graves, as if warm breath was meeting cold air. During summer, the dirt temperature over breathing graves measured 20 degrees cooler than the surrounding ground. And most disturbing, Visitors who placed their hands on breathing graves during full moons reported feeling a pulse, faint but distinct, as if a heartbeat accompanied the respiration. I interviewed several of these visitors over the years, families who'd come to pay respects to children buried decades ago. A woman named Kelly visited in 1998 to see her sister Salma's grave. Salma had been stillborn in 1967. Kelly arrived on a full moon evening, and she felt the breathing and pulse beneath her palm. She told me it felt exactly like holding a sleeping infant. That maternal instinct she'd developed, with her own children recognizing the sensation of a baby's breath and heartbeat. But when she tried to speak to the grave, to say her sister's name, the breathing stopped. She waited in silence, and it resumed. It was as if the children, or whatever was happening beneath those graves, could only continue if left unacknowledged, unnamed, unaddressed. The moment someone tried to establish connection or relationship, the phenomenon ceased until the person fell silent again. I tested this repeatedly over the years with consistent results. Speaking near the graves during full moon breathing stopped the activity. Singing stopped it. Even thinking intensely about the children while touching the graves seemed to interrupt the breathing, though I couldn't prove that scientifically. It was as if attention itself was disruptive, as if these children existed in such a tenuous state that being noticed threatened their ability to maintain whatever form of existence they'd found. The theological implications haunted me. If limbo was real, if these unbaptized children were truly suspended in a state between heaven and hell, perhaps they were so delicate, so precariously balanced, that human consciousness interacting with them risked destabilizing their entire existence. In 2009, a doctoral candidate in anthropology named Louisa received permission to study desert bloom for her dissertation on Catholic burial practices. She spent 6 months conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys, soil analysis, and documentation of the breathing phenomenon. Her findings, which the diocese refused to let her publish, were deeply disturbing. The radar showed anomalies beneath every grave, not bones or caskets as expected, but voids, empty spaces where something should have been but wasn't. She excavated soil from non-grave areas and found normal desert composition, but soil taken from grave surfaces showed impossible properties. It didn't decay, bacteria wouldn't grow in it, plants couldn't root in it. It was sterile in a way that natural soil never is, as if life itself was forbidden from touching these graves. Louisa's most controversial finding involved carbon dating. She analyzed the surface dirt from 10 different graves, with burials ranging from 1934 to 1978, expecting to find soil of corresponding ages. Instead, every sample dated to the same narrow window, 1962 to 1963, the exact period when Vatican II was debating changes to limbo doctrine. It was as if all the graves, regardless of when the burials occurred, had reset or transformed simultaneously during that theological transition. Louisa theorized that the breathing began when the Church started dismantling the concept of limbo, that these children, existing in a state defined by Church doctrine, were somehow responding to the removal of their theological framework. If limbo no longer existed, what happened to souls trapped there? Perhaps they were trying to breathe themselves back into existence, into recognition, into a reality that could acknowledge them. The most personally affecting incident happened in March 2017 during a supermoon. The graves were breathing with unusual intensity, the rise and fall of dirt more pronounced than I'd ever seen. I was conducting my usual observations when I noticed one grave, belonging to a child named Amaris, who died in 1953, breathing at a different rate than the others. While the rest maintained 12 breaths per minute, Amaris's grave was taking rapid, shallow breaths at maybe 30 per minute, the respiratory rate of a distressed infant. I watched for an hour as this single grave struggled, while all the others breathed peacefully around it. Without thinking, I knelt beside Amaris's grave and placed both palms flat on the dirt, and I felt it. Not just breathing, but thrashing. Movement beneath the earth as if something was panicking, trying to break free. The movement stopped the moment I made contact, and I heard something I'll never forget. A sound that wasn't quite crying, but resembled it. A thin, distant wailing that seemed to come from very far away or very deep down. I jerked my hands back, and the frantic breathing resumed. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct said to dig, to help, to rescue whatever was trapped beneath. But Emmett's warning and the diocese's absolute prohibition against excavation kept me frozen. I sat beside that grave all night, watching it struggle, while the others breathed peacefully. And by dawn, when the breathing stopped, as it always did, Amaris's grave had returned to smooth, undisturbed dirt. I filed a report with Father Wilder, now elderly, and still serving as the diocese's liaison to Desert Bloom, and he told me something I'd never heard before. They'd identified 3 other graves over the decades that occasionally breathed at distress rates, and in each case, records showed the mother had died during or shortly after childbirth. Perhaps the children were responding to maternal trauma, carrying echoes of their mother's distress into whatever state they existed in. In my final year, I requested access to all burial records for Desert Bloom, and the diocese reluctantly complied. I spent months cross-referencing names, dates, family histories, and circumstances of death. Patterns emerged that made the breathing even more heartbreaking. Children whose families never visited, and there were many, the shame and grief too overwhelming, breathed more faintly, the rise and fall barely perceptible. Children whose families visited regularly, even decades after burial, breathed strongest, as if remembered love somehow sustained them. The most recent burial, a stillborn girl named J.C. in 1978, breathed with such vigor during full moons that small stones on her grave would shift position from the movement. Her mother, Hunter, had visited every month for 45 years, placing flowers and speaking to her daughter, and somehow that consistent acknowledgement seemed to strengthen whatever J.C. had become in that liminal space beneath the dirt. The church has never provided an official explanation for Desert Bloom Cemetery, and I suspect they never will. In 2007, they quietly changed doctrine to state that unbaptized infants can achieve salvation through God's mercy, effectively dismantling limbo without formally declaring it never existed. But what happens to children who are buried under the old doctrine, consigned to a theological category that no longer officially exists? Desert Bloom suggests they remain trapped in that abandoned framework, breathing in the darkness every full moon, existing in a state that human theology created but can't undo, suspended between life and death, because the rules changed after they'd already been subjected to them. Every month, I watch 214 graves breathe in unison, and I wonder if they're aware, if they're suffering, if they're waiting for something, baptism, recognition, release, that can never come because they exist in a doctrine the church has moved past, but never formally rescued them from. I've trained my replacement, a young woman named Emberlyn, who's prepared for what she'll witness, but can't truly understand until she experiences it. I told her what Emmett told me 31 years ago. Don't try to stop it. Don't touch the dirt when it's happening, and never dig. I told her to document everything, to honor these forgotten children by bearing witness, even when no one else will. And I told her that on particularly quiet, full moon nights, if she stands in the center of the cemetery near the dry fountain, she'll hear something beneath the sound of breathing, a chorus of infant sounds, cooing and gurgling, and the tiny noises babies make, coming from all around her, from beneath the earth, from children who are never supposed to exist in heaven or hell, but who refuse to stop existing at all. Desert Bloom Cemetery isn't haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by theology, by the consequences of doctrines that define the afterlife, without considering what happens when those definitions change. and every full moon, 214 children breathe in unison, reminding us that some churches can be abandoned, some doctrines can be revised, but some souls remain trapped in the frameworks we built around them, breathing in the dark, waiting for a salvation that doctrine says they never needed but practice suggests they'll never receive. My name is Zaid Patel, and I'm a paranormal researcher affiliated with the Southwest Institute for Paranormal Studies based in Phoenix. What I'm documenting here represents the most aggressive and dangerous haunting I've encountered in 15 years of fieldwork, and I'm submitting this report as formal evidence that Apache Junction Pioneer Rest should be permanently closed to the public and possibly exorcised by whatever religious authority is willing to attempt it. Between September 2020 and March 2021, I documented 7 cases of full-body possession at this forgotten cemetery, including my own, and I can state with absolute certainty that whatever inhabits those graves doesn't just haunt. It invades, controls, and fundamentally alters the people who disturb it. Apache Junction. Pioneer Rest sits on 12 acres of scrubland about 3 miles northeast of Apache Junction proper, established in 1862 as a makeshift burial ground for Confederate soldiers who died during the disastrous Arizona campaign of the Civil War. Most people don't realize Confederate forces ever operated in Arizona territory, but in summer 1862, approximately 200 soldiers from Texas attempted to march west to capture gold mines and supply routes. The expedition was catastrophic. Apache attacks, heat exposure, dehydration, and disease killed nearly half the regiment before they retreated back to Texas. 37 soldiers who died during the march were buried hastily in unmarked graves near what's now Apache Junction, and the site was forgotten for over a century until a developer discovered human remains during a 1998 land survey. The Arizona Historical Society identified the remains as Civil War era through buttons, uniform fragments, and bone analysis, and they convinced the developer to preserve the site as a historical cemetery. Simple wooden markers were installed in 2001, bearing names reconstructed from military records. Abdil, Kareem, Corey, Emmett, Wilder, Cohen, Jr., Zaire, and 29 others whose identities could be confirmed through Confederate muster rolls. The cemetery was open to visitors with minimal fanfare, just a small parking area and an information placard explaining the historical context. What the placard doesn't mention is why the developer abandoned the entire 200-acre project after the discovery, or why 3 of the archaeologists who excavated the site refused to return for follow-up work, or why locals in Apache Junction refer to the place as the Screaming Ground and won't go near it after dark. I first learned about Apache Junction Pioneer Rest in August 2020 from a colleague named Corey, who'd been contacted by a woman named Mariana, experiencing severe psychiatric symptoms following a visit to the cemetery. Mariana, age 41, had been hiking in the Superstition Mountains with her husband Cohen and stopped at the cemetery out of curiosity on their way home. She spent maybe 15 minutes walking among the graves, took a few photographs, and left. That night she woke at 3 a.m. speaking in a dialect she'd never learned, a thick southern accent mixed with antiquated grammar, claiming her name was Abdil Johnston, and she died of dysentery on August 4th, 1862. She spoke continuously for 47 minutes before suddenly collapsing unconscious. When she woke, she had no memory of the episode, but complained of intrusive thoughts and a voice that wasn't hers. The episodes continued nightly for 2 weeks, each time Mariana channeling what appeared to be the consciousness of a dead Confederate soldier, always the same one, always Abdil Johnston, always describing his death in horrific detail. The fever, the dehydration, the dysentery that emptied his body until he was too weak to continue marching. During these episodes, Mariana's husband recorded videos showing her face contorted in expressions of agony, her body positioned as if lying on desert ground, her voice pleading for water in an accent that was absolutely authentic to 1860s Texas. Medical and psychiatric evaluation found nothing wrong with her. No neurological issues, no dissociative disorder history, no indication of hoax or performance. The episode stopped only when Mariana returned to the cemetery with Corey and formally acknowledged Abdiel's grave, speaking his name and story aloud. The moment she finished, she felt a release, described it as pressure leaving her head, and she never experienced another episode. Corey brought me the case because it matched patterns from 6 other incidents he documented between 2001 and 2020, all following the same template: visitor to Apache Junction Pioneer Rest, onset of possession symptoms within 24 hours, channeling of specific Confederate soldiers, and cessation only after returning to acknowledge the graves. I was skeptical initially. Possession claims are common in paranormal research and rarely legitimate, but the consistency across multiple unconnected witnesses was compelling. I decided to investigate directly, which, in retrospect, was the worst decision I've made in my professional life. On September 18, 2020, I drove to Apache Junction with recording equipment, EMF detectors, and a detailed questionnaire for documenting potential paranormal activity. I spent 3 hours at the cemetery that afternoon, photographing graves, measuring electromagnetic fields, and sitting quietly near various markers trying to sense any unusual presence. I felt nothing unusual during the visit. The cemetery was peaceful, almost serene, just weathered wooden markers in neat rows with the Superstition Mountains rising dramatically in the background. I noted some interesting EMF readings near the northern cluster of graves, spikes that suggested either underground power lines or geological anomalies, but nothing I'd classify as paranormal. I left at dusk, drove home to Phoenix, and wrote up preliminary notes indicating the site was likely not genuinely haunted, that the possession cases were probably psychosomatic responses to suggestion or local folklore. I went to bed at 11 p.m. feeling confident I'd debunked another ghost story. I woke at 2:47 a.m., standing in my backyard wearing only pajama pants, my hands digging into the hard-packed dirt, my mouth forming words I had no conscious control over. My roommate Arav found me and recorded video on his phone, footage I've watched dozens of times trying to understand what happened. In the video, I'm kneeling in our small patch of desert landscaping, hands bleeding from scraping against rocks and caliche, my face twisted in an expression I don't recognize as my own. I'm speaking in a thick drawl about the heat, about needing water, about Indians in the hills, and how Captain Wilder won't let us rest even though half the men can barely walk. I'm crying, not in my normal voice, but in a strangled, desperate tone, saying, I want to go home to Georgia, to my wife Greta, and my daughters Kaya and Malaysia. I provide specific details, birth dates, addresses in Griffin, Georgia, the names of neighboring farms. Then I say something that made my blood run cold when I watched the recording. I'm not dead yet, but I will be soon, and I'm going to die so far from home that nobody will ever find me. And that's the worst part, knowing Greta will wait and never know what happened. Arav eventually got me back inside and into bed, though I have no memory of any of this. I woke the next morning to find my hands bandaged, dirt under my fingernails, and Arav showing me the video with a look of absolute terror. We spent the day researching Confederate records, and we found him. Private Kareem Blackwood, Company H, 5th Texas Mounted Volunteers, listed as died of disease in Arizona Territory on August 7th, 1862. His wife was named Greta. His daughters were named Kaya and Malaysia. He was from Griffin, Georgia, and every detail I'd spoken while possessed matched Confederate military records with impossible accuracy. I had no prior knowledge of this man, had never researched Texas Confederate units, had no way of knowing these details except through the information I'd somehow accessed while standing on his burial ground 12 hours earlier. The possession episodes continued for 3 weeks, every night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., each time channeling a different soldier from Apache Junction Pioneer Rest. One night, I was Junior Thompson from Louisiana, describing Apache arrows hitting the men in front of me. Another night, I was Zaire Mason from Mississippi, dying slowly from a rattlesnake bite, while my companions marched on without me because we couldn't spare the time to bury the dead anymore. The most disturbing episode involved a soldier named Emmett, who'd been executed by his own officers for desertion. I felt the rope around my neck, experienced the sensation of hanging, gasped for air that wouldn't come until Arav physically shook me awake. Each possession left me exhausted, my throat raw from screaming or speaking in voices that weren't mine, my body aching as if I'd actually endured the physical trauma these men experienced. I documented everything meticulously: video recordings, audio analysis, historical verification of details spoken during possession. I also discovered I wasn't alone. A teacher named Andy had experienced identical possession by a soldier named Wilder in 2015. A construction worker named Johanna channeled a man named Cohen in 2018. Each case followed the pattern Corey had identified, and in each case, the possessed individual provided historically accurate information they couldn't have known through normal means. But what disturbed me most was discovering that the possessions were escalating. Early cases from 2001 involved brief episodes lasting minutes. By 2020, my possessions lasted hours and were becoming more frequent. Arav reported that I was starting to show personality changes even during waking hours. Sudden flashes of anger, use of antiquated vocabulary, brief moments where I seemed to not recognize my own apartment. I consulted with religious scholars, paranormal experts, and historians, trying to understand why these soldiers were so aggressively haunting visitors. The consensus that emerged was disturbing. The Confederate troops who died in Arizona felt profoundly betrayed and abandoned. They'd marched thousands of miles for a cause that would lose the war within 3 years, died in a territory that barely acknowledged the Confederacy's existence, and were buried without proper military honors or notification to their families. Many of their loved ones never learned what happened to them. These weren't men haunting because they were evil. They were haunting because they were desperate, trying to tell their stories to anyone who would listen, and possession was the only communication method strong enough to penetrate across a century and a half of silence. Understanding the motivation didn't make the possessions less terrifying or easier to endure. By October, I was experiencing episodes during daytime, brief moments where I'd lose time and find myself in locations I didn't remember traveling to. Arav insisted I return to the cemetery and attempt the acknowledgement ritual that had worked for Mariana. On October 31st, 2020, I drove back to Apache Junction Pioneer Rest, accompanied by Arav and Corey. We brought printouts of historical records for all 37 confirmed burials, and I spent 2 hours reading each name aloud, providing their rank, home state, date of death, and whatever biographical details military records preserved. For those whose families I'd managed to contact through genealogical research, descendants of Greta, Kaya, and Malaysia Blackwood, for instance, I shared messages and photographs showing their ancestors were remembered. The experience was overwhelming. As I spoke each name and story, I felt presences gathering around me, not threatening now, but attentive, grateful even. I acknowledged that they died far from home, that their deaths mattered, that their service, however misguided the cause, deserved recognition. I promised I'd continue researching their lives and sharing their stories. When I finished with the last name, Corey noticed something remarkable. Every single wooden grave marker was now slightly tilted eastward, toward Texas and the Deep South, as if the soldiers had finally been given permission to face home. The markers had been perfectly vertical when we arrived. We had photographs proving it. Something had shifted them while I spoke, and they remained that way. a permanent memorial to men who just wanted to be remembered and acknowledged. My possession episodes stopped after that ritual, but I wasn't the last case. In December 2020, a historian named Mercy visited the cemetery and was possessed by a soldier named Junior. In February 2021, a photographer named Skyla channeled someone named Zaire. Each time I guided them through the acknowledgement ritual, and each time it worked. But new cases kept emerging because visitors kept coming to the cemetery unaware of the danger. I petitioned the Arizona Historical Society to install proper warnings or close the site, but they refused, citing First Amendment concerns about government entities endorsing paranormal claims. The cemetery remains open, and people continue to visit, and some of them continue to be possessed by soldiers who've been dead for over 160 years, but refuse to rest until their stories are told. The most chilling development came in March 2021, when I received a call from a woman named Aaliyah, whose teenage daughter Deborah had visited Apache Junction Pioneer Rest on a school field trip. Deborah was now experiencing possession symptoms, but with a horrifying twist. She was channeling multiple soldiers simultaneously. Her consciousness fragmented across several different Confederate voices, all speaking at once, arguing with each other, fighting for control of her body. We performed an emergency acknowledgement ritual that partially helped, but Deborah still experiences brief episodes where she slips into 1862 consciousness. She's 15 years old, and her life has been permanently altered because her school took students to a haunted cemetery without understanding what they were walking into. Her parents are considering legal action, but against whom? The school, the historical society, the ghosts themselves. I've documented 7 confirmed possession cases at Apache Junction Pioneer Rest between 2020 and 2021, with 14 additional suspected cases based on witness reports I couldn't personally verify. Every case shares the same characteristics. Visit to cemetery, onset within 24 hours, channeling of specific soldiers with historically accurate details, cessation only after formal acknowledgement. The phenomenon shows no signs of diminishing. If anything, it's intensifying as more people visit the site. I've identified a pattern suggesting the possessions are strongest during summer months, particularly August, when most of the Confederate soldiers died, and weakest during winter. I've also noticed that people who express Confederate sympathies or interest in Southern history are more susceptible, as if the soldiers recognize ideological allies and target them specifically for possession. The ethical implications trouble me deeply. Should we close this cemetery to protect visitors? Or is the possession phenomenon actually valuable, giving voice to men whose deaths were never properly documented or mourned? These soldiers aren't demons or malevolent spirits. They're human consciousness trapped by the circumstances of their deaths, desperate to be remembered. And possession is simply the most effective method they've found to force the living to acknowledge their existence. But the cost to the possessed is severe. Trauma, psychological damage, and in Deborah's case, ongoing symptoms that may never fully resolve. There's no good answer, no clear ethical path forward, just a forgotten cemetery full of desperate ghosts and a steady stream of innocent visitors who don't know what they're walking into until it's far too late. If you ever find yourself near Apache Junction and you see signs for Pioneer Rest, please don't visit out of curiosity or historical interest. The 37 Confederate soldiers buried there aren't just memories or local legends. They're active, aggressive presences that will invade your consciousness, take control of your body, and force you to experience their deaths in visceral detail. The acknowledgement ritual works, but it requires returning to the cemetery and facing the thing that possessed you, and not everyone has the courage or ability to do that. Some people, like Deborah, may never fully recover. These soldiers died angry, abandoned, and forgotten, and they've spent 160 years building enough residual energy to reach across death and grab hold of the living. That cemetery isn't a memorial, it's a trap, and every person who walks through it risks becoming the next voice for ghosts, who will never voluntarily stay silent. My name is Dr. Roland Chen, and I'm submitting this medical case study to the New England Journal of Medicine with full awareness that it will likely be rejected, not because my methodology is flawed or my data is incomplete, but because what I'm documenting violates fundamental principles of infectious disease transmission and challenges everything modern medicine understands about psychosomatic illness. Between April 2019 and November 2020, I treated 17 patients who developed active tuberculosis symptoms, productive cough, hemoptysis, night sweats, weight loss, and radiographic evidence of lung infiltrates, yet tested negative for Mycobacterium tuberculosis through every diagnostic method available. The only commonality among these patients was a single visit to Navajo Springs Cemetery, an abandoned burial ground for tuberculosis sanatorium patients near Holbrook, Arizona. I'm a pulmonologist practicing in Flagstaff, specializing in infectious respiratory diseases, and I've treated hundreds of tuberculosis cases over my 20-year career. I understand the disease process intimately, how the bacteria invades alveolar macrophages, how granulomas form in lung tissue, how the immune response creates the characteristic casus necrosis visible on chest x-rays. What I documented at Navajo Springs defies this understanding completely, presenting symptoms and pathology consistent with active TB infection in patients who have no bacterial presence whatsoever, as if they're experiencing a disease transmitted not through biological agents, but through proximity to a location where suffering and death from tuberculosis became so concentrated it imprinted itself on the physical environment. Navajo Springs Sanatorium operated from 1923 to 1955, one of dozens of tuberculosis facilities established in the Southwest, where dry desert air was believed to aid recovery. The sanatorium treated approximately 800 patients during its operational years, with a mortality rate of 63%, far higher than comparable facilities, due to accepting only the most severe cases that other institutions had rejected. Patients spent months or years in isolation, often dying alone in their beds, while other patients listened through thin walls, knowing they would likely follow. The sanatorium closed in 1955, when antibiotic treatments made long-term isolation facilities obsolete, and the building was demolished in 1967. The cemetery remained, containing 417 graves, arranged in neat rows on 5 acres of high desert scrubland. My first patient, a 34-year-old photographer named Braylon, presented in April 2019, complaining of a persistent cough that had developed over 3 weeks. He'd been healthy previously, no smoking history, no risk factors for tuberculosis, but his symptoms were textbook TB, productive cough with blood-tinged sputum, low-grade fever every evening, drenching night sweats that required changing his sheets, and unexplained weight loss of 14 pounds in 3 weeks. His chest x-ray showed bilateral upper lobe infiltrates with cavitation, exactly the pattern I'd expect in active pulmonary tuberculosis. I immediately ordered sputum cultures, acid-fast bacilli smears, and nucleic acid amplification testing, and I placed him in respiratory isolation pending results. Every test came back negative. No bacteria, no genetic material from Mycobacterium tuberculosis, nothing that would explain his symptoms or radiographic findings. I expanded testing to include atypical mycobacteria, fungal infections, parasitic diseases, autoimmune conditions, anything that might present similarly to tuberculosis. All negative, yet Braylon's symptoms were worsening. His cough became more productive. The hemoptysis increased, his fever spiked higher. I started empiric tuberculosis treatment with the standard 4-drug regimen, thinking perhaps my tests had false negatives, but antibiotics had no effect. His lung infiltrates expanded on follow-up imaging. His oxygen saturation dropped. He was dying from what appeared to be rapidly progressive tuberculosis, except there was no tuberculosis organism present in his body. In desperation, I asked about environmental exposures, travel history, anything unusual. He mentioned he'd spent an afternoon photographing an abandoned cemetery near Holbrook 3 weeks before symptom onset, exactly the incubation period for tuberculosis. I didn't make the connection initially. There was no plausible mechanism for a cemetery visit to cause tuberculosis symptoms in the absence of bacterial infection. But then I admitted a second patient, Harlan, in May 2019 with identical presentation: productive cough, hemoptysis, fever, weight loss, cavitary lung lesions, all test negative for tuberculosis. He was a hiking guide who'd stopped at the same cemetery near Holbrook to use it as a landmark for his GPS routes. Then came patient 3, Taylor, a history teacher who'd taken students on a field trip that included the cemetery. Then patient 4, Peyton. Patient 5, 7. By August 2019, I'd identified 9 patients with phantom tuberculosis, all connected to Navajo Springs Cemetery, all deteriorating despite negative testing and failed antibiotic trials. I drove to the cemetery in September 2019 to investigate, bringing a colleague from infectious disease, Dr. Dylan, and an environmental health specialist named Drake. The cemetery was exactly as patients had described: rows of simple, concrete markers bearing names and dates, most from the 1930s and 1940s. Many markers included epitaphs: gone but not forgotten, at rest after long suffering, free from pain. The graves were remarkably well preserved, given the site had been abandoned for decades. What struck me immediately was the atmosphere. Not supernatural or eerie, but oppressive, a heaviness in the air that made breathing feel laborious. Dylan commented that his chest felt tight. Drake mentioned difficulty taking full breaths. I noticed the same sensation, a pressure on my lungs as if the air itself had become denser. We spent 2 hours documenting the cemetery, photographing markers, collecting soil samples, measuring air quality. Environmental testing showed nothing unusual: no toxic mold spores, no industrial contamination, no airborne pathogens. But as we worked, all 3 of us developed symptoms. My throat became scratchy. Dylan started coughing. Drake complained of chest pain. By the time we left, I was experiencing the distinctive deep, wet cough I'd heard from my patients. We dismissed it as psychosomatic response, anxiety manifesting as physical symptoms, because we knew the cemetery's connection to tuberculosis deaths. But that night, I developed fever. Dylan reported night sweats. Drake coughed up blood-tinged sputum. Within 1 week, all 3 of us showed radiographic evidence of lung infiltrates identical to my patient's presentations. I tested myself obsessively: 7 separate sputum cultures, multiple PCR assays, even bronchoscopy with direct lung tissue sampling. No Mycobacterium tuberculosis. No bacteria of any kind. Yet my symptoms progressed exactly as active TB would progress. I lost 18 pounds in 2 weeks. My oxygen saturation dropped to 87%. I developed pleuritic chest pain from inflammation. Most terrifying was the hemoptysis, coughing up increasing amounts of blood, sometimes a full cup per episode, watching my lungs destroy themselves from the inside, while every test insisted there was no infectious organism causing the damage. I was dying from a disease I didn't have, and I had no explanation for why my body was manifesting late-stage tuberculosis without the tuberculosis bacterium being present. Dylan and Drake experienced identical progressions, and patients I'd admitted months earlier were now critical. Braylon required mechanical ventilation. his lungs so damaged they could no longer exchange oxygen effectively. Several patients developed extrapulmonary manifestations. Harlan had tuberculosis meningitis symptoms, without TB bacteria in his cerebrospinal fluid. Taylor developed skeletal tuberculosis affecting her spine without any organism cultured from bone biopsies. The disease was behaving exactly like disseminated tuberculosis, spreading to multiple organ systems, causing tissue destruction and inflammation consistent with TB pathology, except the causative organism was completely absent. It was as if our bodies had learned to manifest tuberculosis through pure information transfer, without needing the actual bacteria. I expanded my research into the cemetery's history, accessing Arizona Department of Health records from the sanatorium era. I found disturbing patterns in patient records from Navajo Springs. The facility had experimented with controversial treatments in the 1930s and 1940s. Artificial pneumothorax, where one lung was deliberately collapsed to rest it. Thoracoplasty, where ribs were surgically removed to compress diseased lung tissue. And oleothorax, where oil was injected into the pleural space. These procedures were painful, often ineffective, and sometimes fatal. Records described patients screaming during treatments, begging for death, experiencing such profound suffering that several committed suicide by suffocating themselves with pillows rather than endure another day of disease and brutal interventions. What emerged from these records was a picture of concentrated suffering, unlike anything I'd encountered in medical literature. 400 patients dying slowly over decades in the same location, all experiencing the same disease, the same symptoms, the same deterioration, the same desperate hope for recovery that rarely came. The psychological trauma was documented extensively. Patients who'd been told they'd recover, promised that desert air and rest would cure them, only to realize after months or years that they were dying, that the sanatorium was not a hospital, but a place where society sent people with contagious disease to die away from healthy populations. The final entries in many patient files were heartbreaking. Patient died believing she would be discharged next week. Patient expired still making plans for the future. They died with hope intact, never accepting that they wouldn't recover. I developed a theory I could barely articulate to colleagues without sounding insane. The concentration of tuberculosis suffering at Navajo Springs had created what I tentatively called a pathological imprint, residual disease information embedded in the location itself that could trigger phantom symptoms in visitors through mechanisms we don't understand. Not bacterial transmission, but information transmission, as if the cemetery remembered tuberculosis so intensely that proximity to it could cause bodies to manifest the disease without any biological agent. I presented this theory to the Arizona Department of Health, requesting the cemetery be closed and studied. They refused, citing lack of scientific evidence and concern about creating public panic over what they insisted was a cluster of psychosomatic illness. My symptoms plateaued in November 2019, neither improving nor worsening, stabilizing at a state of chronic active disease that left me permanently short of breath, chronically fatigued, and unable to work full-time. Dealin experienced similar stabilization. Drake was less fortunate. His symptoms progressed to respiratory failure, requiring lung transplant evaluation. Of my original 9 patients, 3 died from respiratory complications despite never having tuberculosis bacteria in their bodies. Their death certificates listed cause of death as acute respiratory distress syndrome of unknown etiology, because medical examiners refused to attribute death to tuberculosis without positive cultures. These patients died from a disease that officially didn't exist in their bodies. I continued documenting new cases through 2020. Patient 17, a woman named Zainab, developed symptoms after visiting the cemetery in October 2020. Her presentation was particularly severe, massive hemoptysis, requiring emergency surgery to remove part of her lung that was bleeding uncontrollably. Pathology examination of the resected tissue showed classic tuberculosis pathology, granulomas, caseous necrosis, giant cells, but special staining and genetic testing found no organisms. Her lung tissue looked exactly like tuberculosis infected tissue, had formed all the characteristic pathological features of TB without any bacteria present to trigger those changes. It was as if her lung had learned to perform tuberculosis pathology independently, following a disease pattern encoded somewhere other than in an infectious organism. I consulted psychiatrists, psychologists, specialists in psychosomatic medicine. They acknowledged the cases were unusual. Psychosomatic illness rarely produces objective radiographic changes or tissue pathology, but insisted the symptoms must have psychological origins, perhaps mass hysteria or conversion disorder amplified by medical anxiety. One psychiatrist proposed that knowledge of the cemetery's tuberculosis history created expectation that triggered genuine physiological responses through mind-body pathways we don't fully understand. It was the most generous interpretation I received. Most colleagues simply dismissed my cases as misdiagnosis or suggested I was missing an atypical pathogen my testing hadn't identified. But I know what I'm seeing. 17 patients with clinical and radiographic tuberculosis without any causative organism, 3 deaths, multiple patients requiring supplemental oxygen permanently, lives destroyed by a disease they never contracted through any known transmission route, acquired instead through proximity to a place where tuberculosis suffering was so intense and concentrated it apparently became a property of the location itself. I've reviewed every case obsessively, searching for alternative explanations, environmental toxins, unidentified pathogens, immunological abnormalities, and found nothing that fits the data better than my pathological imprint theory, however scientifically untenable it appears. In March 2021, I returned to Navajo Springs Cemetery one final time, taking maximum respiratory precautions, even though I knew they were useless against whatever causes this phenomenon. I read every gravestone, documenting names and dates. Uriah died at 19 in 1934, Azel at 23 in 1941, Rocky at 17 in 1938. Hundreds of names, mostly young people dying decades before antibiotics would make tuberculosis a treatable disease. I found one marker that particularly affected me, a woman named Ileana who died in 1947, age 21, her epitaph reading, "She died believing she would dance." Again. Streptomycin, the first effective tuberculosis antibiotic, had been discovered in 1943. If Ileana had contracted her infection just a few years later, she would have survived. I knelt at Ileana's grave and experienced something I can't explain scientifically. A sensation of drowning, of lungs filling with fluid, of struggling for breath that wouldn't come. Not my lungs, hers. I felt what she felt dying from tuberculosis in 1947, the suffocation, the exhaustion, the devastating disappointment of realizing she wouldn't recover despite all the promises. The sensation lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it was so vivid and intense I vomited when it passed. I believe I experienced a fragment of her death, transmitted across 74 years through mechanisms I don't have words for. And I understood then that Navajo Springs Cemetery doesn't just remember tuberculosis abstractly. It remembers specific deaths, specific suffering, the accumulated trauma of 417 people who died believing they would recover. My professional reputation has suffered tremendously from publishing these findings. Colleagues question my judgment. Some suggest I've developed psychiatric issues. Medical journals refuse to seriously consider my case series, but I continue documenting every patient who presents with phantom tuberculosis after visiting Navajo Springs, because someone needs to record what's happening even if medicine isn't ready to acknowledge it. We understand disease transmission through bacteria, viruses, parasites, biological agents that follow predictable pathways. We're not prepared for diseases transmitted through memory, through concentrated suffering, through locations that somehow encode and replay pathological processes in visitors' bodies without any traditional infectious mechanism. Navajo Springs Cemetery is teaching us that disease may be more than biology, that suffering itself might be contagious in ways we've never imagined, and that some places remember illness so completely they can infect the living with diseases that officially don't exist. My name is Nathaniel Brooks, and I'm a production coordinator for Desert Hauntings, a paranormal investigation show that aired on streaming platforms between 2018 and 2022. What I'm about to describe comes from footage we shot in November 2019 at Wickenburg Wash Cemetery that was never broadcast, not because it wasn't compelling, but because what our cameras documented contradicted physical reality so completely that our network's legal team refused to air it, citing concerns about fraud accusations despite having no explanation for how we could have faked what we recorded. I'm releasing this account now because the show has been canceled, my NDA has expired, and people need to understand what happens at that cemetery every year on February 22nd, the anniversary of the 1890 Walnut Grove Dam disaster that killed between 150 people and created the strangest haunting I've encountered in 12 years of paranormal television production. Wickenburg Wash Cemetery occupies roughly 3 acres of desert scrubland, about 2 miles northwest of Wickenburg proper. Established in the months following the February 22nd, 1890 dam failure, when bodies continued washing up along the Hassayampa River for weeks after the disaster. The dam had been poorly constructed on Walnut Creek, and when unseasonable rainfall overwhelmed its inadequate spillway, 4 billion gallons of water exploded downstream in a wall estimated at 100 feet high, traveling at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour through narrow canyons. By the time the flood reached Wickenburg, the wave was still 40 feet high, destroying everything in its path and killing dozens of people, many of whom were never identified because the force of the water mutilated bodies beyond recognition or carried them so far downstream they were never recovered. The cemetery contains 87 marked graves and an unknown number of unmarked burials for victims, whose bodies were found but couldn't be identified. Prospectors, migrant workers, Native Americans, Chinese railroad laborers, all swept away by water that shouldn't have been there, killed by a disaster that was entirely preventable and caused by corporate negligence and poor engineering. What makes Wickenburg Wash Cemetery unique isn't just its tragic history, but what happens there every February 22nd at approximately 9 p.m., the time the dam failed in 1890. Visitors report experiencing flooding that security cameras and recording equipment cannot detect, phantom water that can be felt, that causes genuine physiological responses, including hypothermia and near drowning, but that leaves no physical trace and appears invisible to any recording technology we brought to document it. Our production team learned about Wickenburg Wash from local paranormal investigators who documented the phenomenon for years but couldn't get mainstream attention. Because their evidence was so bizarre, it seemed fabricated. They claimed that on the anniversary of the flood, visitors to the cemetery would suddenly find themselves wading through icy water that rose rapidly from ankle-deep to waist-deep to chest-deep within minutes, accompanied by the sound of rushing water and debris. People reported feeling currents pulling at their legs, water pressure pushing against their bodies, and the sensation of drowning as phantom water rose above their heads. Yet security cameras positioned throughout the cemetery showed these same people standing on completely dry ground, appearing to struggle against nothing, their clothes remaining dry even as they exhibited all the physiological signs of cold water immersion. We arrived at Wickenburg Wash on February 20th, 2019 to set up equipment and conduct preliminary investigations before the anniversary date. Our crew consisted of myself, host and lead investigator Quincy Adams, technical director Bellamy Shaw, camera operators Lachlan Torres and Leighton Kim, and sound engineer Amias Rodriguez. We installed 6 stationary cameras with night vision capability, positioned temperature sensors throughout the cemetery, set up EMF detectors and motion-activated recording systems, and established a command center in our production van parked at the cemetery entrance. The preliminary investigation revealed some interesting baseline data, temperature anomalies near certain graves, electromagnetic fluctuations that spiked without apparent cause, but nothing that prepared us for what happened on the evening of February 22nd. We began our investigation at 7 p.m. with full documentation protocols in place. Quincy walked through the cemetery on camera, providing historical context about the 1890 flood, reading names from grave markers where they were still legible, explaining how the disaster had devastated the Wickenburg community. The evening was clear and dry, temperature holding steady around 58 degrees, no precipitation in the forecast. At approximately 8:45 p.m., Quincy reported feeling dampness on his boots. Lachlan's camera showed Quincy's feet on dry ground, no visible moisture, but Quincy insisted his socks felt wet. Within 5 minutes, he claimed to be standing in water up to his ankles, describing it as freezing cold and moving fast. Our thermal cameras showed his body temperature dropping in his lower extremities despite ambient temperature remaining constant and no visible water present. By 9 p.m., Quincy was visibly struggling, appearing to wade through waist-deep water, while our cameras showed him standing on dry earth. The audio was deeply disturbing. Quincy's labored breathing, his voice rising in panic as he described water rising rapidly, his repeated statements that he couldn't keep his footing against the current. Leighton moved closer to help him and immediately reported feeling water herself, shouting that it was up to my knees already, despite being clearly visible on Lachlan's camera standing in the middle of the cemetery on ground that appeared completely dry. I was watching the monitors in the van, seeing 2 members of my crew apparently experiencing a flash flood that wasn't visible on any of our 6 camera angles, and I remember feeling my reality fracturing, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with what they were clearly experiencing. Bellamy and Amias rushed in to assist, and the moment they crossed into the central cemetery area, they both reported the same phenomenon: sudden immersion in icy water that was rising rapidly. From my position in the van, I could see all 4 crew members now appearing to struggle against powerful currents, their movements consistent with people trying to maintain balance in deep, fast-moving water. Quincy shouted that the water was up to his chest, that he could feel debris hitting his legs, that the current was trying to sweep him off his feet. Our thermal imaging showed their core body temperatures dropping precipitously. Quincy went from 98.6 to 95.3 degrees Fahrenheit in less than 10 minutes, entering mild hypothermia despite being in dry 58-degree air, according to every instrument we had. The situation deteriorated rapidly. At 9:07 p.m., Leighton screamed that the water was over her head, and I watched on multiple camera angles as she appeared to go under, her head tilting back, her arms flailing in swimming motions, her body exhibiting every sign of drowning, gasping, thrashing, eyes wide with terror, while standing visibly on dry ground. Lachlan dropped his camera to help her, and the footage from that fallen camera is some of the most disturbing material I've ever reviewed. You can see Leighton and Lachlan appearing to struggle underwater, their movements sluggish and desperate, while simultaneously the abandoned camera shows them in crisp focus standing upright in an empty cemetery under a clear night sky. They were experiencing drowning while physically standing in air, and the cognitive dissonance of watching that footage is overwhelming. I made the decision to evacuate and ran into the cemetery myself. The moment I crossed the property line, I felt it. Icy water slamming into my legs with the force of a real flood, rising instantly to my thighs, then my waist, then my chest within seconds. The sensation was absolutely genuine. Cold that penetrated to my bones, water pressure pushing against my body, the chaotic turbulence of floodwater carrying debris. I felt objects hitting my legs, bumping against me in the current. What I somehow knew were bodies, victims from 1890 being swept past me in phantom reenactment of their deaths. The water had a smell, metallic and organic, the smell of disturbed earth and decomposition. I was experiencing a flood with every sense I possessed, drowning in water that my rational mind knew wasn't there, but that my body was responding to as absolutely real. I managed to grab Leighton, who'd stopped struggling and appeared to be losing consciousness, and dragged her toward the cemetery entrance. The resistance was incredible, like pulling someone through actual floodwater, fighting current and depth and the weight of saturated clothing, even though her clothes were demonstrably dry. When we crossed the property line back onto the road, the water disappeared instantly. One moment I was chest-deep in freezing floodwater. The next I was standing on dry ground, gasping for breath. My clothes bone-dry, my body exhibiting all the physiological symptoms of cold water immersion, despite never having been wet. Leighton was hypothermic, her lips blue, her core temperature at 93 degrees, her lungs showing signs of water aspiration, even though she'd never actually inhaled water. The paramedics who arrived 20 minutes later couldn't explain her condition. She had fluid in her lungs, consistent with near drowning, but the fluid appeared spontaneously without any water source. We extracted the rest of the crew over the next 15 minutes, each of them exhibiting similar symptoms: hypothermia, respiratory distress, exhaustion consistent with swimming or struggling in water, psychological trauma from believing they'd nearly drowned, yet none of them were wet. Security footage from a gas station across the street showed our crew standing in the cemetery, appearing to pantomime drowning, while clearly on dry ground, visible in the station's floodlights. Our own cameras showed the same thing: no water, no flooding, just 5 people exhibiting increasingly panicked behavior in an empty cemetery. But our medical records told a different story. 5 cases of hypothermia, 3 cases of aspiration pneumonia, 1 case of mild cerebral edema consistent with oxygen deprivation, all occurring in people who'd been standing in 58-degree air, breathing normally for the 15 minutes of the event. The next day, after everyone had been medically evaluated and released, we reviewed all our footage trying to understand what happened. The disconnect was absolute. Our subjective experiences versus objective documentation couldn't be reconciled. We'd experienced a flash flood that our equipment insisted never occurred. We'd developed genuine medical conditions from exposure to water that security cameras proved wasn't present. The audio was particularly disturbing because you could hear water sounds on our recordings, rushing, turbulent floodwater. But analysis showed these sounds had no physical source. Appearing on audio tracks, without any corresponding air pressure, changes that would indicate actual water movement. We'd recorded the sound of water that wasn't there, just like we'd experienced the sensation of water that wasn't there. I spent months researching the 1890 disaster, trying to understand the phenomenon. The flood had been catastrophic, killing as many as 150 people, according to some estimates, many of whom drowned in darkness, swept away by water they never saw coming. Bodies were found weeks later miles downstream, some lodged in trees 80 feet above the normal river level, indicating the flood had lifted them that high. Many victims were never identified, buried in mass graves or individually in Wickenburg Wash Cemetery, with markers reading only "Unknown Victim, February 22, 1890. The trauma was immense. Entire families wiped out, survivors left with nothing, a community devastated by a completely preventable disaster caused by corporate negligence. What emerged from my research was the theory that traumatic events can create what I started calling sense memory imprints. environmental recordings of sensory experiences so intense they persist independent of physical reality. The flood victims didn't just die. They died in terror, drowning in darkness in water that arrived without warning, experiencing one of the most primal human fears in its most extreme form. That experience apparently became embedded in the location so deeply that on the anniversary, the sensory information replays for anyone present, triggering genuine physiological responses, even though the physical stimulus isn't there. We weren't experiencing ghosts or spirits. We were experiencing a recorded sensation, a permanent echo of drowning that our nervous systems interpreted as real because the information was detailed enough to override our perceptual systems. Our network refused to broadcast the episode, citing concerns that viewers would accuse us of staging the phenomenon or that we'd face lawsuits if anyone tried to replicate our investigation and was injured. The footage sits in their archives marked "Do Not Air, Legal Hold," and as far as I know, no one has reviewed it since 2020. But I've been back to Wickenburg Wash Cemetery 3 times since our investigation, always avoiding February 22nd, and I've documented ongoing strangeness. Visitors report feeling dampness in their shoes even on dry days. Some people claim to hear rushing water when standing near certain graves. The cemetery caretaker, a man named Arav, told me he's treated multiple cases of hypothermia in people found unconscious in the cemetery on dates other than the anniversary, as if the phantom flooding sometimes occurs outside the main event. Most disturbing was an incident in August 2021 when a group of teenagers vandalized several graves at Wickenburg Wash. All 5 teens, Abdil, Kareem, Corey, Emmett, and Wilder, according to arrest records, were hospitalized with aspiration pneumonia within 24 hours of their vandalism. They all reported identical dreams of drowning, of water filling their lungs, of being swept away by unstoppable currents. Medical imaging showed fluid in their lungs that appeared spontaneously without any exposure to water. The phenomenon had apparently followed them home, punishing them for desecrating the graves of flood victims who died in water and whose deaths had somehow become a permanent property of that location. The teens all required respiratory therapy and psychological counseling, and all 5 remained convinced they nearly drowned despite never being in water. I've tried to warn people away from Wickenburg Wash Cemetery, but it's public land and can't be closed without cause, and authorities refuse to acknowledge paranormal phenomena as legitimate cause. The cemetery receives maybe a dozen visitors per year, most unaware of its history or the phantom flooding phenomenon. But every February 22nd, like clockwork, emergency services respond to the cemetery for hypothermia cases, near-drowning incidents, and psychological crises involving people who experienced flooding that wasn't there. The fire department now positions a unit near the cemetery on the anniversary because they know they'll be needed, though they can't explain why people keep developing cold water immersion injuries in the middle of the desert. Our footage from February 22, 2019 remains the most comprehensive documentation of the phenomenon. 17 minutes of continuous recording showing 5 people exhibiting genuine drowning behavior and developing real medical conditions from exposure to floodwater that every camera angle proves wasn't present. I've shown the footage to neurologists, psychologists, paranormal researchers, and physicists, and no one has provided a satisfactory explanation. The closest I've gotten to understanding it came from a physicist who studies quantum consciousness, who proposed that traumatic sensory experiences might create observational echoes, patterns of sensory data that persist in locations and can be perceived by human nervous systems even when the physical stimuli no longer exist. He suggested Wickenburg Wash Cemetery contains the observational echo of drowning, recorded so completely that brains interpret it as real and bodies respond accordingly. I don't know if that explanation is correct, but I know what I experienced. I know what our cameras documented. I know that 5 people developed hypothermia and aspiration injuries from standing in dry air, and that medical science has no explanation for how that's possible. Wickenburg Wash Cemetery doesn't just remember the 1890 flood, it replays it annually with such fidelity that human bodies can't distinguish the memory from reality, responding to phantom water with real physiological changes, including hypothermia, drowning symptoms, and in some cases death. 3 people have died at that cemetery since 1980 on February 22nd anniversaries, all from drowning or hypothermia, all found on dry ground with dry clothes and no water source anywhere near them. The official cause of death in each case was listed as undetermined, because acknowledging they drowned in phantom water would require accepting that reality is far more flexible and terrifying than we want to believe. My name is Ahmad Whitaker, and I've been a licensed funeral director in Yuma, Arizona for 43 years, managing Whitaker & Sons Mortuary since 1982, when I took over the business from my father. In 4 decades, I've conducted over 6,000 funerals, handled every kind of burial situation imaginable, and developed what I thought was an unshakable professional detachment from death and its rituals. But there's one grave at Sundown Hills Cemetery that has broken every rule I understand about burial, decomposition, and the finality of interment. And I'm documenting this now because after my 6th failed attempt to fill Plot 47B, I've accepted that some spaces in the earth simply refuse to be occupied. And the reasons why may be more terrible than any supernatural explanation could suggest. Sundown Hills Cemetery was established in 1889 on 8 acres of desert hillside overlooking the Colorado River, initially serving as the burial ground for Yuma residents who couldn't afford plots in the more prestigious cemeteries near downtown. The land was donated by a rancher named Madden, who'd made his fortune in cattle, but lost his only son to typhoid fever and wanted a place where working families could bury their dead with dignity. For the first 20 years, Sundown Hills functioned normally. Burials proceeded without incident, graves remained undisturbed, and the cemetery developed a peaceful reputation despite its location on hardpan soil that made digging difficult and required dynamite for the deeper plots. Everything changed in 1910 when they buried Quincy Blackwell in Plot 47B, and the earth rejected him 3 days later. I know the complete history because my grandfather, Bellamy Whitaker, was the funeral director who handled Blackwell's burial, and his detailed notes are preserved in our mortuary archives. Blackwell had been convicted of murdering a prominent Yuma merchant named Lachlan Morrison in a robbery gone wrong, and was hanged at the Yuma Territorial Prison on March 14, 1910. The execution was controversial because Blackwell maintained his innocence to the end, and several witnesses came forward after his death claiming they'd seen Morrison alive after the supposed murder, suggesting Blackwell may have been executed for a crime that never occurred or that someone else committed. Blackwell's body, unclaimed by family who'd disowned him, was buried in the cheapest plot available, 47B, located in the northeast corner of Sundown Hills, in soil that had never been used for burial before. My grandfather's notes from March 17, 1910 read, "Received urgent call from cemetery caretaker Leighton Hayes. He reports that Blackwell's grave has opened itself overnight. Arrived at cemetery to find casket halfway out of the ground, dirt piled around the plot, as if excavated from below. No signs of disturbance by animals or humans. Reburied with 6 men and additional dirt. Disturbing incident." But the grave didn't stay closed. On March 19, caretaker Hayes found the casket again partially ejected from the earth, this time tilted at a 45-degree angle with the top of the coffin visible above ground level. My grandfather supervised a second reburial, this time with concrete poured over the grave to hold it in place. The concrete cracked within 24 hours, and on March 21st, The casket was found completely above ground, resting on the surface as if the earth had physically pushed it out. Blackwell's body was exhumed and moved to a different plot, 52C, where it remained for exactly 6 days before the same phenomenon occurred. The grave opened from below, ejecting the casket to the surface. A third plot was tried, then a fourth, each time with the same result. By early April 1910, Blackwell had been buried and exhumed 7 times, and cemetery officials were facing questions from Yuma residents who were threatening to move their family members' remains elsewhere if the cemetery couldn't keep bodies properly interred. In desperation, Blackwell's casket was loaded onto a wagon and taken 20 miles into the desert, where it was buried in an unmarked location that remains unknown to this day. Plot 47B was left empty, the concrete from the failed burial attempt left in place as a marker, and a notation was made in cemetery records: plot unusable, ground rejection, do not sell. The plot remained empty for 72 years. In 1982, when I took over the mortuary, I was reviewing cemetery records and noticed the anomaly: a prime plot in a well-maintained section marked as unsellable for reasons that seemed absurd. I spoke with elderly residents who remembered the Blackwell incident, but most dismissed it as either grave robbing that was incorrectly reported or foundation issues that made the plot unstable. I convinced the cemetery board to let me attempt a burial in 47B, arguing that modern excavation equipment and proper engineering could overcome whatever soil problems existed in 1910. They agreed reluctantly, and in November 1982, we buried a man named Amias Chen, age 73, who died of natural causes. His family purchased Plot 47B at a discount after I explained its history. The burial proceeded normally, concrete vault installed according to modern standards, no complications. 48 hours later, the caretaker called me at 6 a.m. reporting that Chen's grave had opened overnight. I arrived to find a scene that matched my grandfather's descriptions from 1910. The vault had been pushed upward from below, cracking through 3 feet of earth, the casket tilted at an angle with one end visible above ground level. There were no signs of excavation, no disturbed dirt around the perimeter, no equipment tracks, nothing to suggest human interference. The vault weighed over 2,000 pounds. The force required to push it upward through compacted soil would have required heavy machinery that would have left obvious traces, yet the vault had moved, and the only possible direction it could have moved was up, driven by pressure from below. We reinterred Chen in a different plot, and I convinced the cemetery board to let me conduct soil analysis of Plot 47B. Geotechnical engineers found nothing unusual: standard desert hardpan, no underground voids, no water sources, no geological anomalies that would cause ground movement. But they did find something unexpected. The soil at the bottom of the plot, 6 feet down, was significantly warmer than surrounding earth, registering at 98 degrees Fahrenheit, despite ambient ground temperature being 62 degrees. One engineer commented that the temperature suggested biological activity or decomposition occurring underground, but there was nothing buried there that could generate that heat. The plot was empty, yet something beneath it was producing thermal energy consistent with human body temperature. I became obsessed with understanding Plot 47B. Over the next 30 years, I attempted 5 more burials in that location, each time with different deceased individuals whose families agreed to the discounted rate and understood the plot's history. Every single burial failed. In 1995, we buried Luella Martinez, and her casket was ejected after 36 hours. In 2003, we buried Aileen Thompson, and the vault cracked and displaced after 72 hours. In 2009, Wayne Fletcher. In 2015, Ahmed Hassan. In 2021, Madden O'Connor. Every case identical, burial proceeds normally, then within 48 to 72 hours, immense pressure from below pushes the vault and casket toward the surface until part of it becomes visible above ground level. The displacement always stops when the casket is partially exposed, as if the purpose is to make the burial visible and undeniable, to force acknowledgement that the ground won't accept this occupant. What disturbed me most was a pattern I noticed during the 2015 burial of Ahmed Hassan. I'd installed motion-activated cameras around Plot 47B to document whatever was causing the displacement, thinking I'd catch vandals or witness equipment failure. The footage showed something I still don't understand. At 2:47 a.m., approximately 40 hours after Hassan's burial, the ground begins to move. Not from external force. The movement originates from beneath, the dirt bulging upward as if something is pushing from below. The bulge grows over 15 minutes until the vault cracks through the surface. But what the thermal camera showed during this displacement is what haunts me. A humanoid heat signature lying in the ground beneath the vault, in the exact position a body would occupy in a grave, maintaining the 98-degree temperature that suggests life. The heat signature remains visible throughout the displacement, and when the vault stops moving, the signature fades. I showed the footage to paranormal researchers, physicists, and geologists. No one could explain the heat signature. One researcher proposed that Plot 47B contains what he called a persistent imprint, residual energy from a death so wrongful and traumatic it created a permanent impression that prevents the location from being used for its intended purpose. He suggested that Quincy Blackwell, executed for a murder he possibly didn't commit, dying while proclaiming his innocence, had created such intense resistance to being buried that the resistance became a property of the plot itself, rejecting all subsequent occupants as a form of eternal protest against his wrongful interment. I researched Blackwell's case extensively and found disturbing evidence supporting his innocence. The merchant Lachlan Morrison, who Blackwell supposedly murdered, was seen alive by multiple witnesses 3 days after his reported death. Court records show Blackwell had an alibi placing him 40 miles from Yuma on the murder date, but the alibi witnesses were Chinese railroad workers whose testimony was legally inadmissible in Arizona courts in 1910. Blackwell's conviction rested entirely on the testimony of a single witness named Zaire Jennings, who later recanted, claiming he'd been coerced by local law enforcement to identify Blackwell. By the time Jennings recanted in 1912, Blackwell had been executed and his body buried somewhere in the desert after 7 failed burials in Plot 47B. The wrongful execution theory gained support from an incident in 2021. During my 6th and final attempt to bury someone in Plot 47B, Madden O'Connor, a 78-year-old retired teacher, something unprecedented occurred. 48 hours after burial, the vault began its usual displacement. But this time, visitors to the cemetery reported hearing sounds coming from the grave. Multiple witnesses, including caretaker Junior Moss and visitors Zier Williams and Zaid Rodriguez, reported hearing a voice, muffled but distinct, repeating the same phrase from beneath the ground: "Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty." The voice continued for approximately 20 minutes as the vault was pushed upward, stopping only when the casket broke through the surface. I reviewed audio recordings made by witnesses, and the voice is audible, though analysis by audio engineers determined it wasn't coming from any external source. It had no directional properties and appeared to emanate from the ground itself. More disturbing, voice analysis suggested the speech patterns matched early 20th century dialects consistent with Blackwell's Texas origins based on trial transcripts. We were hearing a dead man speak from a grave that had rejected him over a century ago, his final words echoing through every subsequent burial attempt in a plot that had become permanently contaminated by judicial murder. After the 2021 incident, I convinced the cemetery board to permanently close Plot 47B and install a memorial acknowledging what happened there. The memorial, placed in June 2022, reads, "In memory of a Quincy Blackwell, wrongfully executed March 14, 1910. May this ground that would not hold him bear, witness to his innocence. Since the memorial's installation, the thermal anomaly in Plot 47B has ceased. The ground temperature normalized to match surrounding soil. The periodic displacements that had been observed, even when the plot was empty, small bulges and movements documented by cemetery staff over decades, stopped completely. It's as if acknowledgement was all the ground wanted, recognition that what happened to Blackwell was wrong, and that his resistance to burial was justified. But Plot 47B isn't the only problematic location at Sundown Hills. In researching the cemetery's history, I discovered two other plots that have shown similar rejection patterns, both containing executed prisoners from the Yuma Territorial Prison who maintained their innocence to the end. Plot 51A, where Dustin Reeves was buried in 1907 after being hanged for cattle rustling he likely didn't commit, has displaced 3 subsequent burials. Plot 63C, where Wayne Mitchell was buried in 1905 following execution for murder based on coerced confession later proven false, has rejected every burial attempt since 1987. The pattern is clear. Wrongful execution creates a form of ground contamination, a permanent resistance to burial that persists long after the wrongfully executed person's body has been removed. I've documented 12 plots across 3 Yuma cemeteries that show displacement patterns, and every single case traces back to someone executed under questionable circumstances or buried against their will. The earth literally rejects bodies placed in graves that first held people who died proclaiming innocence. It's as if the ground itself becomes a witness, refusing to forget or forgive, pushing back against every attempt to normalize or move past judicial murder by making burial impossible in locations contaminated by wrongful death. Some errors can't be buried, some injustices won't stay hidden, and some graves will never be filled because the first person placed there impressed upon the location such profound resistance that it became permanent. I'm retiring next month at 70 years old, and I'm leaving detailed documentation of every failed burial, every displacement event, every thermal anomaly and audio recording. Future funeral directors need to understand that certain plots at Sundown Hills Cemetery cannot be used, not because of soil conditions or engineering failures, but because they contain echoes of people who died unjustly and whose final acts of resistance somehow became properties of the ground itself. Quincy Blackwell was hanged for a crime he likely didn't commit, buried in a plot that wouldn't hold him, and spent the next century ensuring that no one else would rest in the grave intended to silence his protests. Plot 47B stands empty now, a memorial to wrongful execution and the stubborn insistence of Earth itself that some injustices are too profound to cover up, even with 6 feet of soil and a century of attempted burials. The ground remembers what we try to forget, and sometimes it refuses to let us bury the evidence of our worst mistakes. My name is Detective Derek Morrison, and after 32 years with the Phoenix Police Department Cold Case Unit, I'm submitting my retirement paperwork along with this statement that will likely be dismissed as early onset dementia or elaborate fabrication. But I need someone to understand what I discovered at Paradise Valley Rest Cemetery between March 2018 and October 2023. I solved 14 cold case murders from the 1940s during that period, cases that had been unsolved for over 70 years, and I solved them not through forensic advances or witness interviews, but by experiencing the final moments of the victims' lives through a phenomenon I can only describe as temporal bleeding, a cemetery where time moves incorrectly, where standing in certain locations causes you to slip backward into the past and inherit memories that don't belong to you, but provide perfect, admissible evidence of murders that everyone thought would never be solved. Paradise Valley Rest was established in 1946 on 15 acres of pristine desert at the base of Camelback Mountain. Designed as an exclusive cemetery for Phoenix's wealthiest families during the post-war boom when Paradise Valley was transforming from farmland into the most affluent community in Arizona. The cemetery was landscaped with imported trees, featured marble mausoleums and elaborate monuments, and maintained strict entrance requirements. Only property owners in Paradise Valley or members of specific social clubs could purchase plots. But tucked away in the northeast corner, separated from the main cemetery by a decorative wall and accessible only through a separate gate, was a section that didn't appear in any cemetery maps or promotional materials, Section D, containing 43 graves of Paradise Valley residents who died under what the cemetery board euphemistically called circumstances requiring discretion. I first learned about Section D in February 2018, while investigating the 1947 murder of Barbara Whitmore, a wealthy widow found strangled in her Paradise Valley estate, with no signs of forced entry and no viable suspects despite an extensive investigation. The case file contained a reference to her burial at Paradise Valley Rest, and when I visited to photograph her grave, the cemetery director mentioned almost casually that Whitmore was buried in Section D with others who died problematically. When I pressed for details, she explained that Section D was where the cemetery buried members whose deaths were violent, suspicious, or scandalous, murders, apparent suicides that families insisted were murders, deaths that involved affairs or financial crimes. The section existed because these families still wanted their deceased buried in Paradise Valley Rest, but the cemetery board didn't want conspicuous graves that might upset other families or damage the cemetery's reputation. I obtained permission to access Section D and spent an afternoon documenting the graves. What I found was a catalog of Phoenix's darkest unsolved mysteries from the 1940s. Bellamy Harrison, age 34, murdered 1943, case never solved. Lachlan Porter, age 41, murdered 1945, no arrests. Leighton Crane, age 29, found dead 1948 under suspicious circumstances, ruled suicide despite family protests. 43 graves representing 43 deaths that had destroyed families, consumed investigative resources, and ultimately faded into cold case obscurity. I photographed every headstone and took detailed notes, planning to review each case file to see if modern forensic techniques might provide new leads. That's when I experienced my first time slip. I was standing near the grave of a woman named Dahlia Chen, age 38, murdered February 14, 1949, when the desert air around me suddenly felt different, heavier, damper, carrying scents that didn't belong in 2018 Arizona. The temperature dropped maybe 10 degrees in seconds, and the sound of traffic from nearby Scottsdale Road faded to silence. I felt disoriented, unsteady, like the ground had shifted beneath me. Then I wasn't standing anymore. I was sitting in an elegant living room decorated in late 1940s style, and I wasn't Detective Morrison, I was Dahlia Chen, and I was terrified because someone I trusted had just walked into the room carrying a silk scarf, and I knew with absolute certainty that in the next 60 seconds, I would be strangled with that scarf by a man I'd been having an affair with, a man whose name was Annika Robertson, a prominent Phoenix developer who couldn't risk me exposing our relationship. The experience lasted maybe 45 seconds. I felt the scarf around my neck, the pressure cutting off my air, the panic and betrayal as someone I'd loved killed me to protect his reputation. Then I was back in 2018 on my knees beside Dahlia Chen's grave, gasping for breath, my throat aching as if I'd actually been strangled. I sat there for 20 minutes trying to rationalize what had happened. Hallucination, heat stroke, some kind of seizure. But the details were too specific, too clear. I'd seen the killer's face, heard his voice, knew his name and exact motivation. When I returned to my office, I researched Annika Robertson and found he'd been a person of interest in Chen's murder investigation in 1949, but was never charged due to lack of evidence and his prominent social connections. He died in 1986, taking his secret with him, except his secret had somehow been preserved at Dahlia Chen's grave, waiting 70 years for someone to experience it. I returned to Section D 3 days later with recording equipment and a determination to understand what had happened. I stood at the grave of Bellamy Harrison, murdered in 1943, and within 2 minutes I felt the time slip beginning, the air changing, the present fading, and suddenly I was Bellamy Harrison in my bedroom at 11 p.m. on August 7, 1943, and I was being beaten to death by my business partner Kezia Morrison, who'd embezzled from our shared company and needed me dead before I discovered the theft. The experience was brutally vivid. I felt every blow, experienced the terror and pain, and most importantly, I received information that Bellamy couldn't have known at the moment of his death, but that existed somehow in the temporal recording, where Kezia had hidden the embezzled money, how she'd covered her tracks, details that I verified through historical research, and that proved beyond doubt that Kezia Morrison, never seriously considered a suspect in 1943, had murdered her business partner. Over the next 5 years, I returned to Section D 43 times, once for each grave, and I experienced 43 deaths. Not all of them resulted in solvable cases. Some victims never saw their killers. Some died too quickly to process what was happening. Some were killed by people whose identities I couldn't determine from the fragmented memories I inherited. But 14 cases provided complete, actionable information, names of killers, motives, locations of evidence, details that could only have come from the victims themselves. I documented everything, cross-referenced with historical records, and built case files that would have seemed impossible without explaining their source. So I lied in my reports, claiming I'd discovered new evidence through archival research and witness interviews, rather than admitting I'd solved murders by experiencing victims' deaths through temporal anomalies at a haunted cemetery. The phenomenon wasn't consistent. Some graves produced immediate time slips, others required multiple visits before anything happened. The duration varied. Some experiences lasted less than a minute. Others extended for 5 or 6 minutes of subjective time. The intensity varied too. Some deaths I experienced with full sensory immersion. Others came as fragmented impressions, emotions, and images without complete narrative coherence. But certain patterns emerged. Time slips were strongest during early morning hours, between 5 and 7 a.m., the period when most of the murders had occurred. They were more likely to happen when I was alone. Witnesses or recording equipment seemed to prevent or weaken the phenomenon, and most disturbingly, the experiences left physical traces. After experiencing Natalie Brennan's shooting death from 1944, I had a bruise on my chest exactly where the bullet had struck her. After experiencing Cheyenne Walsh's drowning in 1946, I coughed up water for 3 hours, despite never being in water. I consulted experts carefully, never revealing the full truth. A physicist, I described the phenomenon to suggested I might be experiencing what he called retrocausal information transfer, the idea that traumatic events create informational echoes that can travel backward through time or exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously. A neurologist I spoke with proposed that certain locations might trigger what he called spontaneous ancestral memory access, though he admitted there was no scientific mechanism for such a thing. A parapsychologist told me about object imprinting and residual hauntings, suggesting that intense emotions or traumatic deaths can be recorded in locations and played back under certain conditions. None of these explanations fully satisfied me, but they all acknowledged that what I was describing, experiencing other people's memories from specific locations, had been reported before and remained scientifically unexplained. The ethical implications tormented me. I was solving murders using inadmissible evidence obtained through impossible means, then falsifying reports to make the solutions appear legitimate. But these were real victims, real families who deserved justice, real killers who'd escaped accountability for decades. I rationalized that the ends justified the means, that bringing closure to 14 families outweighed my dishonesty about methods. But I knew I was crossing lines that detective work isn't supposed to cross, treating supernatural phenomena as investigative tools, building criminal cases on evidence that violated everything law enforcement and courts understand about information gathering. The breakthrough came in October 2022 when I experienced the death of Kelly Martinson, murdered March 3, 1941, the oldest unsolved case in Section D. Kelly had been found dead in her Paradise Valley home, with no evidence of who killed her or why. During my time slip at her grave, I experienced her final minutes and learned she'd been murdered by her husband Wayne Martinson and his mistress Louisa Caldwell, who'd conspired to kill Kelly for her inheritance. What made this case unique was that Wayne had documented the entire plan in a journal he'd kept hidden in the walls of their home, a home that still stood in Paradise Valley, now owned by different people but structurally unchanged since 1941. Based on the memories I inherited from Kelly's death, I obtained a warrant to search the property, and we found Wayne's journal exactly where Kelly's memories indicated it would be, hidden in a false wall in the master bedroom. The journal was extraordinary evidence, a complete confession written in Wayne's hand, describing how he and Louisa had planned Kelly's murder, how they'd staged it to look like a burglary, how they'd spent Kelly's inheritance together. The case was officially solved, the first breakthrough in 81 years, and it validated my methods in a way that terrified me because now I knew the time slips were providing genuinely accurate information that could stand up in court. I'd solved 13 other cases before Kelly Martinson, but her case was the first where the evidence I obtained through supernatural means led directly to physical proof that would be admissible in court. It meant the phenomenon was real, reliable, and that I'd been building criminal cases on information from actual victims reaching across time to identify their killers. My last visit to Section D was October 15, 2023, when I experienced the death of Salma Brennan, murdered April 19, 1942. During the time slip, I lived through her strangulation by her nephew, Teresa Chen, who'd killed her for her estate. And I learned something that changed everything. Salma had known about Paradise Valley Rest Cemetery's peculiar properties. She'd been friends with the cemetery's original landscape architect, Ora Brennan, who deliberately designed Section D to function as what Ora called a memorial archive, selecting the location based on geological and geographical factors that might allow traumatic memories to be preserved and accessed. Ora believed that murder victims deserved a way to tell their stories even after death, and she'd created Section D specifically as a location where their final moments might be recorded and later experienced by someone who could bring them justice. I spent 3 months researching Ora Brennan and found journal entries confirming what Salma's memories had revealed. Ora had deliberately engineered Section D as a paranormal investigation tool, using principles drawn from occult traditions, ley line theories, and her own intuitions about how location and tragedy might interact. She died in 1954, taking detailed knowledge of her methods with her, but she succeeded in creating exactly what she intended: a cemetery section that preserved murder victims' final moments and made them accessible to investigators who stood in the right locations at the right times. Paradise Valley Rest Section D wasn't accidentally haunted. It was deliberately designed to be haunted, constructed as a memorial that doubled as an evidence archive for deaths that might otherwise never be solved. I'm retiring now because I can't continue investigating deaths by experiencing them, living through murders that happened before I was born, carrying memories that aren't mine but that feel as real as my own experiences. 14 solved cases in 5 years is my legacy, but the cost was absorbing 14 traumatic deaths, feeling 14 people die violently, carrying psychological scars for murders I didn't witness, but experienced so vividly I might as well have. Paradise Valley Rest, Section D remains accessible to anyone who visits, and the temporal phenomena that allowed me to solve 70-year-old murders continues to function. But I can't do this anymore. Can't keep dying repeatedly in service of justice for people who died generations ago. Someone else will have to stand at those graves, experience those deaths, and solve the remaining 29 unsolved murders in Section D. The victims are still there, still waiting, their final moments preserved in a cemetery designed specifically to ensure they'd never be forgotten, that their deaths would eventually be avenged, even if justice had to wait decades for the right person to stand in the right place and inherit the memories that would finally reveal the truth. If any of this resonates with you, if you're drawn to the unknown and the unexplained, subscribe to Verified Souls. We explore stories like these, encounters with the supernatural that challenge everything we think we know about death, memory, and justice. These aren't just scary stories. They're reminders that some truths refuse to stay buried, and some voices refuse to be silenced, no matter how much time passes.